With charges closing in around him, Bomilcar chose flight rather than face trial. Jugurtha escaped with him, leaving Rome with a bitter observation that would become one of the most famous remarks associated with the Numidian king. After witnessing how deeply bribery had penetrated Roman political life, he supposedly declared that Rome itself was for sale and could be bought if only someone wealthy enough appeared to purchase it. When Metellus returned to the African campaign in 109 BC, frustration was already spreading through the Roman ranks. Some soldiers complained that their commander was moving too cautiously against Jugurtha and allowing the war to drag on. At the same time, Metellus maintained extremely strict discipline within his own army. Punishments for misconduct could be severe, creating resentment among troops who believed that their general was harsher towards them than he was aggressive toward the enemy. The following year brought an even more brutal episode. The Senate of Vaca had helped betray the Roman garrison stationed in the town to Jugurtha, and Metellus responded without mercy. He ordered the senators responsible for the betrayal to be executed. Turpilius, the Roman commander of the garrison, was also condemned because the circumstances of his surrender had raised suspicions about his loyalty. Metellus was equally ruthless toward deserters who had entered Jugurtha's service. When several Thracian and Ligurian deserters were handed over to him, they were subjected to horrific punishments intended to serve as a warning to anyone considering abandoning the Roman army. By 107 BC, command of the war had passed to Gaius Marius. After Marius reached Cirta, envoys arrived from Bocchus, king of Mauritania, seeking negotiations. Marius responded by sending two important representatives, his lieutenant Aulus Manlius and his quaestor Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Their mission would become part of a diplomatic struggle that ultimately proved just as important as the fighting on the battlefield. Bocchus attempted to justify his hostility toward Rome by raising a territorial dispute. He argued that Marius had deprived him of lands that he had previously taken from Jugurtha. Manlius rejected this claim by reaching back into the history of Roman involvement in North Africa. According to him, Rome had originally conquered the disputed territory from Syphax and later granted it to Massinissa. Such a grant, however, did not mean that Rome had permanently surrendered its authority over the land. It remained dependent upon the will of the Roman Senate and people. The situation had changed dramatically since Massinissa's time. Jugurtha had become an enemy of Rome after murdering members of Massinissa's family and entering into conflict with Roman power. Manlius therefore argued that Jugurtha could no longer claim the privileges once granted to Rome's ally. From the Roman perspective, Bocchus could not simply seize territory from Jugurtha and declare it his own, because Rome still considered itself the ultimate authority behind the original settlement. Despite these disagreements, Bocchus continued searching for a way to make peace. He sent another embassy to Marius and hoped that Sulla would help secure an agreement. The journey nearly ended in disaster when robbers attacked the ambassadors and stripped them of their possessions. Sulla nevertheless welcomed them when they arrived, treated them generously, and kept them under his protection until Marius returned from operations in Gaetulia. Marius then encouraged the envoys to convince Bocchus that cooperation with Sulla offered the best path forward. By this point, the Mauritanian king was beginning to reconsider his alliance with Jugurtha. Years of warfare had made the political situation increasingly dangerous, and Bocchus now had to decide whether protecting Jugurtha was worth risking a direct confrontation with Rome. Still unwilling to reveal his intentions openly, Bocchus created the appearance that he was preparing for further war. He sent agents among neighboring Ethiopian peoples whose territories stretched westward toward the region of Mount Atlas, supposedly to gather additional forces. Behind this display of military preparation, however, secret diplomacy was moving in the opposite direction. Bocchus requested another meeting with Sulla, and Marius agreed to send his quaestor to negotiate. The talks were no longer simply about peace between Mauritania and Rome. Bocchus was moving toward a far more decisive solution, sacrificing Jugurtha in exchange for Roman friendship. There remained one dangerous obstacle. Jugurtha had placed his trusted associate Apsar in Bocchus's camp, specifically to observe the king and report any suspicious activity. Bocchus therefore had to conceal his negotiations carefully. Working with his associate Magdalus and a Carthaginian freedman named Cornelius, he devised a plan to mislead Apsar while continuing his secret dealings with Sulla. The war was now approaching its decisive political turning point. Jugurtha had survived Roman armies, shifting commanders, and years of relentless campaigning, but the alliance that protected him was beginning to collapse from within. Bocchus was no longer merely an ally caught between two powers. He was preparing to choose the side that offered him the greatest advantage, and that choice would eventually place Jugurtha himself within Rome's grasp. When Philip V of Macedon first moved against Roman interests, Rome was in no position to make him its main concern. The Republic was still locked in its enormous struggle with Hannibal. Roman forces were fighting across Italy, Spain, Africa, and the wider Carthaginian sphere, while Sicily also demanded military attention. With so many fronts consuming Roman manpower and resources, Philip initially seemed like a distant problem that could be dealt with later. Philip, however, saw Rome's difficulties as an opportunity. He had no major grievance against the Romans at this stage, but he hoped to expand Macedonian power and strengthen his position in Greece. He therefore sent an embassy led by Xenophanes to Hannibal in Italy. Philip proposed a partnership. Macedon would support Hannibal against Rome, while Hannibal would later help Philip establish greater control over the Greek world. Hannibal accepted the proposal, and an agreement was confirmed by oath. He then sent representatives back with Philip's envoys so that the Macedonian king could formally give his own guarantee. The arrangement might have remained secret, but Roman naval forces intercepted the ambassadors during their journey and brought them to Rome. The Romans now had direct evidence that Philip was cooperating with their most dangerous enemy. The discovery transformed Philip from a secondary concern into an active threat. Angered by Roman interference, Philip intensified his actions in the region and attacked Corcyra, which was connected to Rome. The conflict that followed opened a new front at a moment when the Republic was already fighting for survival against Carthage. Religious tradition also became associated with Rome's decision to confront Macedon. The Sibylline books were interpreted as predicting a struggle involving a Macedonian ruler named Philip. The prophecy distinguished between two rulers of that name, presenting one as a figure who would exercise great power, and another as a king destined to lose his position and eventually fall before warriors from the west. For the Romans, such prophecies could give divine meaning to political and military decisions. As the struggle developed, several powers attempted to prevent the conflict from consuming Greece. In 208 BC, representatives of Ptolemaic Egypt, Chios, Mytilene, and Amenander, king of the Athamenes, joined diplomatic efforts to reconcile Rome, Philip, and the Aetolian League. They met at gatherings traditionally used by the Aetolians for political consultation, and tried to establish terms acceptable to all sides. The Roman commander Sulpicius claimed that he lacked the authority to conclude a final peace. Privately, however, he informed the Senate that continued warfare between the Aetolians and Philip actually benefited Rome. As long as Philip remained occupied by enemies within Greece, Macedon had fewer resources available for challenging Roman interests elsewhere. The Senate therefore rejected an immediate settlement and reinforced the Aetolians with approximately 10,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. Supported by these Roman troops, the Aetolians captured Ambracia. Their success proved temporary. Once the Roman forces moved away, Philip returned and recovered the city, demonstrating that Macedonian power remained formidable despite Roman intervention. Diplomats again tried to stop the fighting, but their message became increasingly critical of both sides. They warned that the rivalry between Philip and the Aetolians was creating the conditions for permanent Roman involvement in Greek affairs. Every new appeal for Roman military assistance gave the Republic another reason to send armies across the Adriatic, and became more deeply involved in the politics of Greece. This argument found considerable support among those present. When Sulpicius attempted to answer the criticism, the crowd refused to listen and openly approved the ambassador's warning. Behind the immediate conflict was a much larger concern. Greek rivalries were gradually giving an outside power the opportunity to establish itself as an arbiter in the eastern Mediterranean. By 205 BC, the Aetolians had grown tired of the war and decided to negotiate with Philip independently, without waiting for Roman approval. Their decision weakened Rome's position and helped bring the first major confrontation between Rome and Macedon toward an end. Philip and the Roman commander subsequently sent representatives to arrange a broader settlement. The resulting peace required both sides to respect the allies and friends of the other. Yet the agreement resolved little beyond the immediate fighting. Neither Rome nor Philip regarded the settlement as the beginning of a genuine friendship. It was essentially a temporary arrangement between two powers that remained deeply suspicious of each other. That suspicion soon proved justified. Philip resumed an aggressive policy in the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean. After ordering his maritime subjects to prepare a fleet, he attacked Samos and Chios and turned against territories connected with King Attalus of Pergamon. His forces eventually threatened Pergamon itself, while the surrounding countryside suffered extensive destruction. Philip's campaigns were remembered not merely for military conquest, but also for attacks on places normally protected by religious and social custom. Temples and burial sites were reportedly damaged during the devastation. Such actions strengthened the hostility of Philip's enemies and made it easier for them to present the Macedonian king as a danger to the wider Greek world. Rhodes also became a target. Although the Rhodians had previously worked to promote peace, Philip ravaged territories under their influence. Elsewhere, Macedonian forces entered Attica and threatened Athens. Philip apparently calculated that these actions did not violate his agreement with Rome because the affected territories were not explicitly protected by the earlier settlement. At the same time, alarming reports began circulating about a possible understanding between Philip and Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire. According to these reports, the two kings intended to exploit the weakness of Ptolemaic Egypt. Philip would support Antiochus in attempts to gain Egyptian possessions, including Egypt itself and Cyprus, while Antiochus would assist Philip in expanding toward Cyrene, the Cyclades, and Ionia. Whether every detail of the reported agreement was accurate mattered less than the fear it produced. A coordinated expansion by Macedon and the Seleucid Empire threatened to transform the political balance of the eastern Mediterranean. Rhodes therefore informed Rome about the situation and emphasized the danger posed by Philip's growing ambitions. Athens soon added its own complaints, sending representatives to Rome to describe the Macedonian pressure against the city. The Aetolians also reconsidered their earlier decision to make a separate peace. Now dissatisfied with Philip, they accused him of violating the spirit of their agreement and asked Rome to restore their former alliance. The Romans had not forgotten that the Aetolians had previously abandoned the common war by negotiating independently, and they criticized them for it. Nevertheless, the larger strategic situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Rome sent diplomatic warnings eastward, telling Antiochus not to interfere in Egypt and demanding that Philip cease attacks against Rhodes, Athens, Attalus, and other communities regarded as Roman friends or allies. Philip rejected the Roman pressure. From his perspective, Rome was exceeding the limits of the peace agreement and interfering in matters that did not concern it. He replied that the Romans themselves should respect the treaty they had made with him, rather than attempting to dictate Macedonian policy throughout the Greek world. Diplomacy had reached its limit. The fragile settlement created after the first conflict collapsed, and Rome once again prepared for war in Greece. A new Roman army crossed toward the Macedonian sphere, while naval forces accompanied the campaign. What had begun years earlier as a secondary struggle during the war against Hannibal was now becoming a direct contest over power and influence in the eastern Mediterranean. In 198 BC, Philip V of Macedon met the Roman commander Titus Quinctius Flaminius in a conference arranged through the efforts of Epirota representatives. Flaminius presented Rome's demands in striking terms. Philip was expected to withdraw from Greece, not so that Rome could simply replace Macedonian domination with its own, but so that the Greek cities could recover their independence. He was also expected to compensate communities that had suffered during his campaigns. For Philip, accepting such conditions would mean surrendering much of the influence Macedon had spent decades building across Greece. Military pressure continued alongside diplomacy. At one stage, a local shepherd offered the Romans valuable information about a rarely used mountain route. He claimed that lightly armed troops could follow the path and reach their objective within 3 days. Knowledge of hidden roads and difficult terrain could completely change a campaign, allowing an army to bypass fortified positions that seemed almost impossible to attack directly. Flamininus also understood that defeating Philip required political support from the Greeks themselves. Roman representatives were therefore sent to the Achaean League, hoping to persuade its members to abandon their Macedonian alliance and join Rome, Athens, and Rhodes. Philip responded with ambassadors of his own, reminding the Achaeans of their existing relationship with Macedon and asking them to remain loyal. The decision was far from simple. The Achaeans were already dealing with Nabis, the ruler of Sparta, whose activities threatened their own territory. They were also divided over Rome. Many still preferred Philip, because earlier Roman operations under Sulpicius had left bitter memories among parts of the Greek population. Rome could present itself as a defender of Greek freedom, but its soldiers had already demonstrated that Roman intervention could bring destruction as well as liberation. The debate inside the Achaean assembly became increasingly heated. Supporters of cooperation with Rome argued forcefully for a change of alliance, while many of Philip's supporters eventually walked out in frustration. With much of the opposition absent, those remaining accepted an alliance with Flamininus. The decision had immediate military consequences. Achaean forces joined the Roman side and participated in the siege of Corinth, bringing siege equipment to support the campaign. In 197 BC, Philip and Flamininus met again, this time near the Malian Gulf. Representatives of Rhodes, the Aetolian League, and Amenander of Athemania used the meeting to present their grievances against the Macedonian king. Flamininus demanded that Philip remove his forces from Phocis and proposed that representatives from both sides travel to Rome so the Senate could consider the dispute. The Greek delegates focused particular attention on 3 strategically crucial Macedonian garrisons. These strongholds had become known as the fetters of Greece, because controlling them allowed Macedon to dominate enormous areas of the Greek world. Chalcis gave Philip leverage over Euboea, Boeotia, and Locris. Corinth controlled the principal land entrance into the Peloponnese. Demetrius provided a powerful position overlooking regions associated with the Aetolians and Magnesians. For many Greeks, genuine freedom was impossible, while Macedonian soldiers remained in these 3 positions. The Senate therefore questioned Philip's representatives about whether their king intended to abandon the garrisons. The ambassadors could provide no definite answer. Rome responded by leaving the final decision to Flamininus, authorizing him to act according to what he considered appropriate. The negotiations collapsed. Philip would not accept Roman demands, while Flamininus was unwilling to retreat from the principle that Macedonian military power had to be removed from key Greek territories. With diplomacy exhausted, the armies returned to war. After suffering another major defeat, Philip recognized that his position had become increasingly dangerous. He sent a herald to Flamininus requesting peace negotiations. Flamininus agreed to another meeting, but his willingness to negotiate angered the Aetolians. They had expected Rome to use its victory to destroy Philip's power completely, and some even accused Flamininus of having been bribed by the Macedonian king. Flamininus had broader strategic concerns. Eliminating the Macedonian monarchy might remove Philip, but it could also create a dangerous vacuum. At the same time, a total Macedonian collapse could allow the Aetolian League to become overwhelmingly powerful in Greece. Rome had fought alongside the Aetolians, but that did not mean Roman commanders wanted them to dominate the region after the war. Before establishing the final terms, Flamininus invited Rome's allies to state their positions individually. Most favored moderation. Philip's sudden reversal of fortune reminded them how quickly military circumstances could change. A powerful king who had dominated much of Greece had been reduced to asking for peace, and many believed his defeat resulted partly from the unpredictability of war rather than the complete disappearance of Macedonian strength. The Aetolians took a much harder position. Their representative Alexander argued that neither Rome nor Greece would be secure while Philip's kingdom remained intact. In his view, the only lasting solution was the destruction of Macedonian power itself. Flamininus rejected this argument. He maintained that Roman policy did not require the complete destruction of every defeated enemy. Rome had often allowed defeated states to survive after forcing them to accept new political realities. More importantly, he argued that Macedonia served an important strategic purpose. Beyond its northern frontiers lived peoples capable of raiding southward, and a functioning Macedonian kingdom formed a defensive barrier between those groups and the Greek cities. Destroying Macedon, therefore, might solve one problem while creating another. Flamininus preferred a weakened kingdom that could no longer dominate Greece, but remained strong enough to defend its northern frontier. Philip would retain his throne, but his ability to interfere in Greek affairs would be sharply reduced. The initial peace conditions reflected this strategy. Philip had to abandon Greek territories that he had previously refused to surrender. He was required to pay 200 talents toward Roman war expenses and provide hostages from leading Macedonian families as security for his obedience. Among those hostages would be his own son, Demetrius. A 4-month armistice would remain in effect while the Roman Senate considered the agreement. Philip accepted. Yet when the terms reached Rome, the Senate decided that Flaminius had been too lenient. In 196 BC, additional demands were imposed that dramatically reduced Macedonian influence throughout Greece. Every Greek city previously controlled by Philip was to receive its freedom, and Macedonian garrisons had to leave before the coming Isthmian Games. This provision directly attacked the system through which Macedon had maintained political and military control over the Greek world. Philip's naval strength was also dismantled. He was required to surrender almost his entire fleet, retaining only a single larger vessel and 5 smaller decked ships. This ensured that Macedon would no longer possess the maritime power necessary to challenge Roman interests or easily rebuild its influence across the Aegean. The financial settlement was equally severe. Philip had to pay 500 talents of silver immediately and another 500 talents over the following 10 years. He was also ordered to return prisoners and deserters in his possession. These conditions went far beyond the settlement originally proposed by Flaminius. Philip nevertheless accepted them. His willingness to submit demonstrated how completely the military balance had shifted against him. Macedon survived as a kingdom, but its position as the dominant power in Greece had been broken. Rome then sent 10 commissioners to assist Flaminius in arranging the post-war settlement, following Roman practice after major conflicts. Together they would determine how the new political order should function and how the territories removed from Macedonian control would be reorganized. The settlement marked a decisive transformation in Mediterranean politics. Philip remained king, and Macedonia continued to exist, but the network of garrisons and alliances that had allowed Macedonian rulers to dominate Greece was being dismantled. Rome had entered the war claiming to defend Greek independence, yet its victory also established the Republic as the power capable of deciding the political future of Greece itself. With the settlement of the war complete, Flaminius traveled to the Isthmian Games, where Greeks from many different cities had gathered. The stadium was packed when a trumpet called the crowd to silence. A herald then stepped forward to deliver an announcement that would become one of the most celebrated moments of Rome's early involvement in Greece. The proclamation declared that Rome had defeated Philip V and the Macedonians, and that the Greek communities were now to be free. Foreign garrisons were to disappear, tribute was no longer to be imposed upon them, and the cities were to govern themselves according to their traditional laws and customs. Rome was presenting its victory not as the conquest of Greece, but as the liberation of the Greeks from Macedonian domination. The reaction was extraordinary. The stadium erupted in celebration, and the noise became so overwhelming that some spectators had difficulty hearing the entire announcement. Groups called for the herald to repeat it, wanting confirmation that they had understood correctly. Flamininus suddenly became the symbol of Greek liberation. Wreaths and ceremonial ribbons were thrown toward him, while several cities voted to erect statues in his honor. Greek communities also sent delegations to Rome, carrying golden crowns as expressions of gratitude. Many formally entered into friendly relations with the Roman Republic. The Second Macedonian War had ended with Philip still ruling Macedonia, but his political control over Greece had been shattered. Rome, meanwhile, had emerged as the strongest outside power involved in Greek affairs. The relationship between Philip and Rome soon took an unexpected turn. Only a few years after fighting the Romans, the Macedonian king became an important supporter of their campaign against Antiochus III. When Roman forces moved eastward in 190 BC, their route took them through Macedonia and Thrace toward Asia. The journey was difficult, and Philip's cooperation became extremely valuable. Philip provided troops, supplies, and financial assistance. He repaired damaged roads, constructed crossings over rivers that would otherwise have slowed the Roman advance, and helped clear hostile Thracian groups from the route. His forces accompanied the Romans through dangerous territory until they reached the Hellespont, from where the campaign against Antiochus could continue into Asia. Rome rewarded Philip for this cooperation. His son Demetrius, who had been held as a hostage, was allowed to return home, and some of the financial obligations still imposed upon Macedonia were cancelled. Philip's importance became even clearer when the victorious Roman army later returned without his protection. Thracian groups attacked the soldiers, killed many of them, and seized part of the wealth they were carrying home. The disaster demonstrated how much Philip's earlier assistance had protected the Roman advance. Yet cooperation did not eliminate the deeper mistrust between Macedonia and Rome. After Antiochus had been defeated, complaints against Philip began arriving from various Greek communities. He was accused of ignoring parts of the political settlement established by Flamininus and of failing to respect Roman decisions concerning Greece. In 188 BC, Philip sent Demetrius to Rome to defend Macedonian policy before the Senate. The choice was deliberate. Demetrius had spent time in Rome as a hostage and had made a favorable impression there. Flamininus also supported him, giving the young prince an important advantage when he appeared before the senators. Demetrius was still inexperienced and apparently uncomfortable speaking before such a powerful audience. Rather than forcing him to construct a complicated defense himself, the Senate allowed him to rely on a written memorandum prepared by Philip. The document addressed Roman complaints individually. Some demands had already been satisfied, while Philip promised to deal with others, even though the memorandum repeatedly suggested that several Roman decisions had been unfair. The Senate chose not to punish Philip. His recent assistance during the war against Antiochus still carried considerable weight, and Rome announced that it would overlook the disputed matters. But there was a humiliating element in the decision. The senators emphasized that their leniency was being granted largely because of Demetrius. For Philip, this was deeply insulting. During the war with Antiochus, he had possessed an excellent opportunity to turn against Rome. Antiochus had sought his support, and a Macedonian alliance with the Seleucid king could have created serious difficulties for the Romans. Instead, Philip had remained loyal, assisted Roman armies, supplied them, and protected their march toward Asia. He had expected this cooperation to restore his standing. Instead, he found himself repeatedly accused by Greek rivals and treated as a ruler who required Roman forgiveness. Even worse, the Senate appeared to value his young son more highly than Philip himself. The king concealed his anger publicly, but resentment toward Rome was steadily growing. Further Roman decisions made the situation worse. In disputes involving Philip and neighboring powers, Rome increasingly favored Eumenes of Pergamon. Territories Philip considered his own were transferred to Eumenes, reinforcing the Macedonian belief that Rome intended to reduce the kingdom piece by piece rather than allow it to recover its former strength. Philip eventually concluded that Macedonia needed to prepare for another possible confrontation. His preparations were cautious and largely hidden from Roman observation. He rebuilt military resources and worked to restore confidence in Macedonian power. He was determined to demonstrate that defeat by Flamininus had weakened his kingdom but had not destroyed it. By the time Philip died, the tension between Macedonia and Rome had not disappeared. Instead, it passed to the next generation. His son Perseus inherited the throne, and a kingdom that had been rebuilding its military strength while living under constant Roman suspicion. Perseus quickly became a source of anxiety in Rome. Macedonian power appeared to be recovering, and the new king was developing closer relationships with communities throughout Greece. This was particularly troubling because resentment against Roman interference had grown in several places. Some Greeks who had once welcomed Rome as a liberator had become increasingly uncomfortable with the Republic's influence over their political affairs. Reports from Roman representatives added to these concerns. Ambassadors who had traveled toward the Bastarnae returned with descriptions of a Macedonia that looked increasingly prepared for war. Its defensive positions had been strengthened, military supplies were abundant, and the kingdom possessed a generation of young men who had received serious military training. To Roman observers, these preparations seemed difficult to explain as ordinary defensive measures. Philip had spent his final years rebuilding Macedonia, and Perseus appeared to be continuing the same policy. Rome began to fear that the kingdom defeated in the Second Macedonian War was once again becoming capable of challenging Roman authority. Perseus understood the danger and attempted to calm Roman suspicions through diplomacy. He sent representatives to reassure the Senate and tried to avoid giving Rome an obvious justification for war. At the same time, however, his efforts to cultivate friendships throughout Greece made those assurances less convincing to his enemies. One of the most influential voices against Perseus came from Eumenes II, king of Pergamon. The rivalry between Pergamon and Macedonia had deep roots, and Eumenes had every reason to fear a revival of Macedonian power. In 172 BC, he traveled personally to Rome and addressed the Senate, presenting Perseus as a growing threat to the entire Roman political order in the eastern Mediterranean. Eumenes portrayed the Macedonian king as fundamentally hostile to Rome. He reminded the senators that Perseus had been deeply involved in Philip's military rebuilding and claimed that, after becoming king, he had expanded those preparations rather than dismantling them. In this interpretation, Macedonia had never truly accepted its defeat. It had merely used the years of peace to recover. The king of Pergamon also focused on Perseus's growing popularity among the Greeks. Perseus was cultivating relationships with Greek communities and offering assistance where it could increase Macedonian influence. He supported groups in places such as Byzantium and maintained connections with the Aetolians and Boeotians. To Eumenes, these were not isolated diplomatic gestures, but parts of a broader strategy to rebuild a Macedonian sphere of influence. There were additional accusations. Perseus was said to have strengthened his position in Thrace and to have interfered in disputes involving Thessalians and Perrhaebians. According to Eumenes, Macedonian diplomacy was deliberately exploiting divisions among Rome's partners and attempting to prevent communities from turning to the Senate for assistance. The struggle was therefore no longer simply about armies or fortresses. It was becoming a competition for loyalty throughout Greece. Perseus hoped to restore Macedonia's prestige without immediately provoking another disastrous war, while Rome increasingly interpreted every Macedonian success as evidence of a larger plan. The promise of Greek freedom announced so dramatically at the Isthmian Games had transformed the political landscape, but it had not created lasting stability. Rome had removed Philip's dominance without withdrawing from Greek affairs, while Macedonia had survived without accepting permanent weakness. Under Perseus, those unresolved tensions were approaching another breaking point, setting the stage for a new and decisive war between Rome and the Macedonian kingdom. Eumenes continued building his case against Perseus before the Roman Senate, presenting almost every aspect of the Macedonian king's behavior as evidence of a growing threat. He reminded the senators that Perseus had already come into conflict with rulers friendly to Rome. Abrupolis had been driven from his kingdom, while Perseus was also accused of involvement in a plot against the Illyrian leader Arthatorus and of later protecting men connected with his murder. Eumenes did not limit himself to military or diplomatic accusations. Even Perseus' marriages became part of the argument. The Macedonian king had formed marriage connections with powerful royal houses, strengthening his position among neighboring states. The impressive celebrations surrounding these alliances, including a bridal procession accompanied by Rhodian ships, could easily be portrayed in Rome as signs that Perseus was constructing a wider network of influence. More surprisingly, Eumenes turned Perseus's personal virtues against him. The king was still relatively young, yet he had developed a reputation for discipline, moderation, energy, and careful government. These qualities had helped him gain admiration far beyond Macedonia. Instead of presenting this popularity as harmless, Eumenes suggested that it made Perseus more dangerous. An irresponsible king could destroy himself. A disciplined and popular ruler might rebuild Macedonian power. That was the central message Eumenes wanted the Senate to understand. Perseus was not dangerous simply because he possessed soldiers or fortified cities. He was dangerous because he was young, ambitious, respected by many Greeks, politically connected, and geographically close to Roman interests. Macedonia had been defeated before, but under such a ruler it might once again become the center of resistance to Roman influence. The Senate was already deeply suspicious. Behind the formal accusations stood a broader strategic concern. Rome did not want a powerful Macedonian monarchy recovering along the eastern side of the Adriatic. Perseus belonged to a dynasty with a long history of rivalry with Rome, and his rapid rise in prestige made senators increasingly uncomfortable. Eumenes' accusations therefore provided a convenient justification for fears that already existed. Rome moved toward war, although the decision was initially concealed. Perseus sent Harpalus to answer Eumenes' accusations, while Rhodes also sent a representative who hoped to challenge the Pergamene king's claims directly. The Senate refused to allow them to confront Eumenes while he was still in Rome. Only after he had departed were they permitted to appear. This treatment angered the Macedonian and Rhodian representatives. Their speeches became unusually outspoken, and their frustration only worsened Roman hostility. By this point, Rome was already suspicious not only of Perseus, but increasingly of Rhodes, whose independent diplomacy and connections in the eastern Mediterranean made some senators uneasy. Not everyone in Rome accepted Eumenes' arguments without question. Some senators believed that the Pergamene king was pushing the republic toward a major conflict because of his personal rivalry with Macedonia. They suspected that his warnings reflected his own political fears as much as genuine concern for Roman security. The Rhodians were even less sympathetic toward Eumenes. When representatives from various monarchs attended the great Rhodian festival of Helios, Rhodes refused to receive the delegation sent by Eumenes. The gesture demonstrated how complicated the political situation had become. The eastern Mediterranean was not simply dividing neatly into supporters of Rome and supporters of Perseus. While returning to Asia, Eumenes stopped near Delphi to perform a sacrifice. There, 4 attackers concealed behind a wall attempted to assassinate him. The incident immediately intensified the political crisis. For Rome, the attack could be connected to the wider case being assembled against Perseus, whether or not his responsibility could actually be established. Rome continued publicly gathering reasons for confrontation, even though the decision for war was already taking shape. Diplomats were dispatched throughout the Mediterranean to secure political support before hostilities began. They approached rulers such as Eumenes, Antiochus, Ariarathes, Massinissa, and the Ptolemaic government of Egypt. Roman representatives also traveled throughout Greece and neighboring regions, including Thessaly, Epirus, and Acarnania, as well as strategically important islands. Rome was effectively preparing the diplomatic battlefield before armies began moving. The goal was to prevent Perseus from building a coalition and to ensure that Macedonia would face the coming conflict as isolated as possible. These diplomatic efforts placed the Greeks in a difficult position. Perseus had cultivated an image as a ruler sympathetic to Greek culture and interests, and this had earned him genuine popularity in some communities. Others had their own reasons for distrusting Roman intervention. Nevertheless, Rome's military power made open resistance increasingly dangerous, forcing many states to cooperate regardless of their private sympathies. When Perseus learned about Rome's diplomatic activity, he attempted to resolve the crisis without war. He sent ambassadors to the Senate asking why Rome appeared to be organizing states against a king who was officially still its ally. Macedonia argued that if Rome had legitimate complaints, those grievances should first be discussed through diplomacy rather than used immediately as justification for military preparations. The Senate responded by repeating many of Eumenes' accusations. Perseus was blamed for his expansion into Thrace, the growth of his army, and his accumulation of military supplies. The attempted assassination of Eumenes also became part of the atmosphere of suspicion surrounding Macedonia. Taken together, Rome argued, these actions did not resemble the behavior of a ruler committed to lasting peace. Perseus sent another delegation, and this time the Macedonian defense became much more forceful. His representatives argued that when a state had already decided upon war, almost anything could be transformed into an excuse. If Rome genuinely respected treaties as strongly as it claimed, they asked, then it should identify exactly what Perseus had done to violate the existing agreement. The existence of a Macedonian army, they argued, could hardly constitute such a violation. Rome did not forbid other kings from maintaining military forces, and Perseus had every right to defend his kingdom. Macedonia faced internal security concerns, neighboring peoples, and potential foreign enemies. Maintaining soldiers and weapons was therefore a basic responsibility of kingship, not proof of an intended attack on Rome. Nor, according to the Macedonians, had Perseus behaved like someone preparing an immediate war against the Republic. He had repeatedly sent ambassadors to Rome, reaffirmed peaceful relations, and recently renewed the treaty between the two states. If Rome had accepted that treaty, it could hardly treat older disputes as new evidence that Perseus had suddenly become an enemy. The ambassadors then addressed the case of Abrupolis. Perseus admitted driving him from his kingdom, but argued that the action had been defensive. Abrupolis had first entered Macedonian territory, forcing Perseus to respond. More importantly, Rome already knew about the incident when it renewed its agreement with Macedonia. If the Senate had considered Perseus's conduct unacceptable, why had it confirmed the treaty afterward? The dispute involving the Dolopians was defended on similar grounds. Macedonia argued that they were subjects of Perseus and therefore fell under his royal authority. Their governor had been captured and tortured to death, an act that no government could simply ignore. The Macedonian representatives challenged the senators to consider how Rome itself would respond if one of its subject communities murdered a Roman official in such a manner. Finally came the accusation involving the killers of Arthatorus. Macedonia acknowledged that the fugitives had once found refuge within Perseus's territory, but his ambassadors argued that granting sanctuary to political exiles was hardly unique. Rome itself regularly received people fleeing from other states. Nevertheless, Once Perseus learned that the Senate considered their presence offensive, he ordered the men to leave Macedonia. The Macedonian defense therefore rested on a simple argument. None of these incidents proved that Perseus intended to attack Rome. Some had already been known when peaceful relations were renewed. Others concerned his authority within his own kingdom, and still others had been corrected once Roman objections became clear. But the dispute had moved beyond individual accusations. Rome was no longer judging Perseus solely by what he had done. It was increasingly judging him by what he might become. A recovering Macedonia, a popular king, stronger defenses, growing connections with the Greeks, and memories of earlier wars had combined to create an atmosphere in which even ordinary acts of government could be interpreted as preparations for conflict. Perseus could answer the accusations one by one, but answering Rome's deeper fear was far more difficult. The question was no longer whether Macedonia had technically violated a treaty. It was whether Rome was willing to tolerate the return of a strong Macedonian kingdom at all. The Macedonian ambassadors continued their defense of Perseus by addressing his involvement with Byzantium, the Aetolians, and the Boeotians. They admitted that the king had provided assistance to these states, but insisted that none of that support had been directed against Rome. Macedonia had even informed the Romans about these activities earlier, and at the time, the Senate had raised no serious objection. Only after Eumenes arrived in Rome with his accusations, they argued, had these actions suddenly been transformed into evidence of Macedonian aggression. This, according to the delegation, revealed the weakness of the Roman case. Eumenes had been permitted to present a long list of charges against Perseus, yet Macedonian representatives had not been allowed to challenge him directly while he was still present. The ambassadors portrayed the entire process as one-sided, suggesting that Rome was listening carefully to those who wanted war, while denying Macedonia an equal opportunity to defend itself. They then turned to the attempted assassination of Eumenes at Delphi. Perseus had been treated as a likely suspect, but his representatives questioned why Rome should immediately accept that conclusion. Eumenes had accumulated enemies across the Greek and non-Greek world, they argued, and numerous communities had reasons to resent him. An attack on such a controversial ruler could hardly prove Macedonian involvement by itself. Another allegation seemed even more extraordinary to the Macedonians. A man named Irenaeus of Brundisium had allegedly been connected with a plan in which Perseus intended to poison members of the Roman Senate. The ambassadors dismissed the story as absurd. Why would the Macedonian king entrust such a fantastic conspiracy to a Roman citizen with connections inside Rome? Even if several senators could somehow be killed, there was no reason to believe that the survivors would suddenly become friendly toward Macedonia. The delegation accused Irenaeus of inventing a convenient story for those who already wanted conflict. To them, such allegations were not genuine evidence, but useful political weapons. Once Rome had begun looking for reasons to fight, almost any accusation could be incorporated into the case against Perseus. Eumenes himself received the strongest criticism. The Macedonians claimed that his campaign against Perseus was driven by personal hostility, jealousy, and fear of Macedonia's recovery. They pointed out that Eumenes had even managed to portray the king's popularity as suspicious. Perseus's reputation as a Philhellene, his disciplined lifestyle, and his avoidance of excessive drinking and luxury were being treated not as virtues, but as reasons to fear him. The ambassadors challenged the logic behind such accusations. If Rome considered a hard-working, restrained, and respected neighboring ruler inherently dangerous, then the problem was no longer anything Perseus had actually done. His very competence had become the accusation. Rome, they warned, risked appearing unable to tolerate any nearby kingdom that was stable, prosperous, and well-governed. Perseus therefore offered to submit the accusations to examination. His representatives declared that Eumenes, Irenaeus, or anyone else making charges against him should present their evidence openly before the Romans. Rather than avoiding investigation, the Macedonian king claimed to welcome it. The delegation also reminded the Senate of Philip V's conduct during Rome's war against Antiochus III. Philip had possessed every reason to resent Rome after his own defeat, and Antiochus had given him an opportunity to strike back. Instead, the Macedonian king had supported the Roman campaign, supplied Roman forces, protected their passage through difficult territory, and helped them reach Asia. Such assistance, the ambassadors argued, should not be forgotten simply because the immediate danger from Antiochus had disappeared. Rome had once recognized Philip's loyalty and rewarded him for it. Perseus now asked the senators to remember that history before condemning Philip's son as an enemy. Above all, Macedonia appealed to the treaties that Rome had concluded first with Philip and later with Perseus. These agreements had been confirmed through solemn obligations, and the Macedonian delegation reminded the senators that treaties were not merely political documents. Oaths had religious significance, and violating them without sufficient cause risked offending the gods invoked when they were made. Perseus maintained that geographical proximity could not itself be treated as aggression, nor could Rome reasonably declare war because Macedonia maintained an army, prepared its defenses, or possessed a disciplined ruler. Every independent kingdom had to protect itself. If military readiness alone were proof of hostile intentions, then almost every powerful state could be accused of preparing for war. The ambassadors ended by turning Eumenes' argument against him. A prepared and responsible neighbor, they suggested, should actually provide greater stability than a weak and chaotic one. Rome should not allow fear or jealousy to dictate its foreign policy, particularly when no clear violation of the existing treaty had been demonstrated. Their arguments changed nothing. The Senate offered no meaningful response to the Macedonian defense. Instead, Rome publicly declared war. The negotiations that Perseus had hoped might preserve peace had reached their end, and the diplomatic struggle was replaced by open confrontation. The Roman consul immediately ordered the Macedonian ambassadors to leave Rome that same day. They were given 30 days to leave Italy completely. Similar orders were issued to Macedonian residents throughout Roman territory, turning a diplomatic crisis into a sudden mass departure. The decree created confusion and anger. Many Macedonians had expected negotiations to continue and were completely unprepared to leave. Families suddenly had to gather their possessions, arrange transportation, and begin journeys with almost no warning. There were not enough animals or vehicles available to carry everyone and their belongings. Some travelers could not even reach proper shelter before nightfall. People were stranded along roads, while others gathered near the city gates with their wives and children. The disorder reflected the speed with which relations between Rome and Macedonia had collapsed. People who had expected another round of diplomacy suddenly found themselves citizens of an enemy kingdom. The war that followed did not immediately produce the easy Roman victory some may have expected. Perseus was capable of fighting effectively, and after one Macedonian success he sent representatives to the Roman commander Publius Licinius Crassus to discuss peace. His exact motivation was uncertain. Perseus may have been testing the Romans after his victory, attempting to discover whether the setback had weakened their determination. He may also have genuinely feared Rome's enormous reserves of manpower and resources. A battlefield victory against one Roman army did not mean that Macedonia could survive a prolonged war against the entire republic. Perseus offered concessions that went beyond what his father Philip had previously been willing to accept. From the Roman perspective, however, the moment for negotiated compromise had passed. Crassus responded with an extraordinary demand. Peace would only be possible if Perseus surrendered both Macedonia and himself to Roman authority. The response demonstrated how fundamentally the nature of the conflict had changed. Rome was no longer simply demanding limitations on Macedonian policy. It was asking Perseus to place his kingdom and his own fate entirely in Roman hands. Crassus, however, had his own political problem. Roman forces had recently been forced to retreat, an embarrassing development for a commander representing a state that expected victory. He therefore attempted to control the story of what had happened. Calling his forces and allies together, Crassus praised the Thessalians for their courage during the disaster. At the same time, he placed responsibility for the retreat on the Aetolians and other Greek contingents, accusing them of having fled first. Some of these men were subsequently sent to Rome. The episode revealed that the struggle between Rome and Perseus was being fought on more than one battlefield. Military success mattered, but so did reputation, diplomacy, alliances, and the ability to shape how victories and defeats were understood. Perseus had temporarily shown that Macedonia could still defeat Roman forces, yet Rome possessed something far more difficult to overcome: the ability to absorb setbacks, mobilize new resources, and continue the war until its enemy could no longer do the same. As the campaigning season continued, neither side spent every day seeking a decisive battle. Much of the remaining summer was devoted to the basic problem that determined whether ancient armies could continue fighting at all: food. Perseus organized the harvesting and threshing of grain directly in the countryside, while the Romans gathered and processed their supplies inside the security of their camp. Behind the dramatic battles of the Macedonian War stood a constant struggle to keep thousands of soldiers fed. Among the Roman commanders, Quintus Marcius Philippus became known for sharing the hardships of the campaign personally. He was already around 60 years old and was described as heavy and physically cumbersome, yet he remained at the front of difficult marches and military labor. His willingness to endure the same exhausting conditions as his men strengthened his authority at a time when Rome was attempting to force its way through challenging Macedonian terrain. The Roman advance eventually produced a moment of panic in Perseus's headquarters. The king was bathing when a messenger suddenly arrived with news that the enemy was approaching. Perseus immediately jumped from the water and reacted as though disaster had already occurred, declaring in alarm that he had been captured before the battle had even begun. The episode reflected the increasing psychological pressure surrounding the Macedonian king, as Roman forces penetrated deeper into his defensive system. Perseus later recovered some of his confidence, but his behavior became increasingly unpredictable. During his earlier panic, he had ordered 2 trusted men, Nicias and Andronicus, to destroy valuable resources rather than allow them to fall into Roman hands. They were instructed to throw royal money into the sea and burn the Macedonian ships. The orders were not fully carried out, and both the money and the ships survived. Under normal circumstances, Perseus might have been grateful that such valuable assets had been preserved. Instead, their survival created another problem in his mind. Nicias and Andronicus knew exactly how frightened he had been when he issued the commands, and they could reveal the king's loss of nerve to others. Perseus therefore had both men killed. The decision marked a darker phase in his rule. A king previously regarded as intelligent, persuasive, disciplined, and capable of careful planning increasingly responded to setbacks with suspicion and brutality. As the military situation deteriorated, his judgment seemed to deteriorate with it. Earlier in the war, Perseus had often demonstrated considerable political skill. He could negotiate effectively, calculate advantages, and show courage in battle. Yet prolonged pressure exposed weaknesses that success had concealed. Defeat made him hesitant when decisiveness was required, and impulsive when patience would have served him better. His policies began changing rapidly, sometimes contradicting decisions he had made only a short time earlier. Meanwhile, diplomacy surrounding the war became increasingly confused. Rhodes sent representatives to Marcius to congratulate him on the progress of the Roman campaign. During their discussions, however, Marcius unexpectedly encouraged the Rhodians to send an embassy to Rome and promote negotiations between Perseus and the Republic. The Rhodians interpreted this advice as evidence that Macedonia remained stronger than Rome publicly admitted. They assumed that a Roman commander would not recommend peace unless the idea had support from higher authorities. In reality, Marcius appears to have acted largely on his own initiative rather than according to a coordinated Roman policy. Believing that there might still be an opportunity to end the war diplomatically, Rhodes sent representatives both to Rome and to Marcius. This decision would later prove politically dangerous because Roman attitudes toward states attempting to mediate with Perseus were becoming increasingly suspicious. Perseus was also searching for new military partners. One of the most important was Gentius, an Illyrian king whose territory bordered Macedonia. Perseus offered him 300 talents in exchange for an alliance, paying part of the agreed sum in advance. Gentius soon committed himself openly. He attacked Roman interests in Illyria, and when Roman envoys named Perpenna and Petilius arrived to investigate, he imprisoned them. This transformed the Illyrian ruler from a potential enemy into an unmistakable opponent of Rome. Perseus then made a disastrous calculation. Since Gentius had already attacked Rome and imprisoned Roman representatives, the Macedonian king concluded that his ally had passed the point of no return. Gentius was now Rome's enemy, whether or not he received the rest of the promised money. Perseus therefore decided to withhold the remaining payment. The decision saved money in the short term, but revealed the king's increasingly destructive obsession with preserving his treasury. At precisely the moment when Macedonia desperately needed dependable allies, Perseus was becoming reluctant to spend the wealth required to keep them loyal. He simultaneously searched for support farther north. Representatives were sent toward the Getae beyond the Danube, whose warriors could provide valuable reinforcements. Perseus also opened secret discussions involving Eumenes of Pergamon, despite the Pergamene king having been one of his most determined political enemies. Perseus offered Eumenes money in exchange for several possible services. Ideally, Eumenes might change sides and support Macedonia. If that proved impossible, he could attempt to negotiate peace between Perseus and Rome. At minimum, Perseus hoped he might remain neutral. There was another calculation behind the approach. Perseus knew that Rome might eventually discover the negotiations. Even if Eumenes refused every proposal, the mere fact that he had discussed terms with Macedonia could make the Romans question his loyalty. In that sense, Perseus could potentially damage one of his enemies without ever securing his cooperation. Eumenes refused to join Macedonia. According to the account, however, he was willing to discuss payment for other forms of cooperation. He supposedly demanded 1,500 talents to help arrange peace with Rome, or 1,000 talents simply to remain outside the conflict. At almost the same moment, Perseus received encouraging news from the north. A large force of Getae was approaching, including thousands of cavalry and infantry. Suddenly believing that he possessed another military option, Perseus became less interested in paying Eumenes. He refused to purchase Eumenes' neutrality, arguing that such an arrangement would dishonor both rulers. He remained willing to pay for a successful peace settlement, but proposed keeping the money at Samothrace until an agreement was actually completed. The arrangement went nowhere, although Perseus did achieve one indirect objective. Eumenes' contacts with Macedonia contributed to Roman suspicions about the Pergamene king. The arrival of the Getae should have provided Perseus with a major opportunity. Their commander, Cloelius, expected substantial payment before committing his warriors. He demanded 1,000 gold status for himself, 10 for every cavalryman, and 5 for each infantryman. Altogether, the price exceeded 150,000 pieces of gold. Perseus responded by sending ceremonial gifts, including military clothing, horses, and gold ornaments for important officers. He also sent 10,000 staters, but this was far below what the mercenaries expected. When Perseus requested a personal meeting, Cloelius had one immediate question: had the promised gold arrived? Upon learning that it had not, he refused to proceed and sent the Macedonian representatives back to their king. Rather than simply paying the force that had traveled such a great distance to support him, Perseus began finding reasons to avoid the expense. He complained to his companions that the Getae could not be trusted, and suggested that allowing such a large foreign army into Macedonia might itself be dangerous. If thousands of mercenaries suddenly rebelled, he argued, controlling them would become extremely difficult. Perseus therefore claimed that a smaller force would be safer. 10,000 warriors, he suggested, might be manageable if trouble developed. Yet while telling his own advisors that the Getae were too numerous and dangerous, he sent a different message to the mercenaries themselves, asking them to provide roughly half their army and promising that payment was on its way. The contradiction exposed how badly financial anxiety was influencing his strategy. Only a short time earlier, during a moment of panic, Perseus had been prepared to throw enormous amounts of royal wealth into the sea. Now, when that same wealth could purchase thousands of experienced soldiers at a critical stage of the war, he hesitated to spend it. Clodius was not interested in further promises. When the Macedonian envoys returned, he again demanded to know whether they had brought the gold. They attempted to discuss other matters, but he refused to listen until the question of payment had been answered. The answer was still no. Clodius immediately turned his army around and marched away. Perseus had lost a powerful reinforcement that had already reached the region and was prepared to fight for him. It was one of the clearest examples of how his desire to preserve money undermined Macedonia's military position. Strategic opportunities were being missed elsewhere as well. Perseus spent the winter at Phila with a substantial army, but failed to launch a major offensive into Thessaly. This was particularly important because Thessaly supplied Roman forces. A determined Macedonian attack there might have disrupted the enemy's logistics and forced Rome to react. Instead, Perseus sent forces toward Ionia in an attempt to interfere with supplies arriving from the east. The decision allowed the Romans to maintain access to the resources of Thessaly, while Macedonian strength was diverted toward a more distant objective. The war would eventually produce one of Rome's most celebrated commanders, Lucius Aemilius Paulus. His campaign against Perseus brought him extraordinary military success. Yet ancient writers saw his story as an example of how personal tragedy could accompany public glory. Paulus had 4 sons. His 2 older sons had entered other distinguished Roman families through adoption. One became associated with the Fabian line, while another would become famous as Scipio Aemilianus. His 2 younger sons remained with him, but both died within days of his great triumph. One son died only 3 days before the celebration, while the other died 5 days afterward. At precisely the moment when Rome was honoring Paulus as the conqueror of Macedonia, his own household was experiencing devastating loss. When Paulus later addressed the Roman people and gave the traditional account of his command, he reflected on the extraordinary speed of his success. He recalled sailing from Brundisium to Corcyra in a single day. From there, he reached Delphi after 5 days of travel and performed the appropriate religious sacrifices. 5 days later, he arrived in Thessaly and assumed command of the Roman army. Only 15 days after that, he had defeated Perseus and effectively brought Macedonia under Roman control. Few commanders could have experienced such a rapid sequence of victories. But the speed of his success had made Paulus uneasy. In a culture deeply conscious of the instability of fortune, extraordinary prosperity could itself seem dangerous. He feared that such uninterrupted success might provoke a sudden reversal. At first, he worried that disaster would strike his army during its return. Once the soldiers were safely home, he feared that misfortune might instead fall upon Rome. The catastrophe came, but it was personal rather than political. With both of his younger sons dead, Paulus told the Roman people that fortune had finally demanded its price from him. He could now stop fearing that the extraordinary success of the Macedonian campaign would be balanced by some disaster affecting the state. The suffering had fallen upon his own family instead. The contrast was unforgettable. Before the Roman public stood a commander who had destroyed the power of Perseus and achieved one of the greatest victories of his generation. Yet within his own household, victory had brought no happiness. The Romans admired his achievements while grieving for his loss. Paulus did not live many years after these events. His victory over Perseus had permanently changed the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. Macedonia, once the kingdom of Philip II and Alexander the Great and later a major rival of Rome, had been decisively broken as an independent great power. Yet the personal tragedy surrounding the victor gave the story a darker conclusion. At the height of public success, Paulus discovered how little military glory could protect a man from private grief. The ancient Greeks used the name Illyrians for a broad collection of peoples living beyond Macedonia and Thrace, stretching across the western Balkans toward the Danube and the Adriatic. Their lands covered an enormous and difficult region of mountains, valleys, rivers, and coastline. Ancient writers tried to estimate its size in terms of travel time, while Roman measurements later described a territory extending for thousands of stades from south to north and from the interior toward the Adriatic. Like many ancient peoples, the Illyrians were also given a legendary ancestry. One tradition claimed that their name came from Illyrius, a son of the Cyclops Polyphemus, and Galatea. According to the story, Polyphemus had 3 sons named Celtus, Illyrius, and Gallas. Each supposedly became the ancestor of a great people, the Celts, the Illyrians, and the Galatians. The genealogy became even more elaborate from there. Illyrius was said to have fathered sons such as Encheleus, Autarius, Dardanus, Maeadus, Taulus, and Perebus, along with several daughters. From them supposedly descended tribes including the Encheles, Autariate, Dardani, Partheni, Dacereti, and others. Another branch of the legend connected the Pannonians, Scordisci, and Tribali to the same mythical family. These traditions were not reliable history in the modern sense, but they reveal how ancient writers tried to explain the complicated ethnic landscape of the Balkans. A huge number of tribes occupied the region, sometimes cooperating, sometimes migrating, and very often fighting one another. Among the best known were the Tribali and the Scordisci. Both once controlled large territories, but repeated warfare gradually weakened them. The Tribali suffered so severely that surviving groups eventually moved across the Danube and sought refuge among the Getae. Although they had once been powerful during the age of Philip II and Alexander the Great, their political importance later disappeared almost completely. The Scordisci experienced a similar decline. Internal conflicts and later wars with Rome reduced their strength dramatically. Some withdrew to islands in the Danube, while others eventually returned and settled near the borders of Pannonia. Even after their greater power had vanished, communities bearing the Scordician name continued to survive in the region. Other Illyrian peoples were famous for their command of the sea. The Ardii built a powerful maritime presence along the Adriatic, although they were eventually defeated by the Autariate, whose strength was based more heavily on land warfare. The Ardii had defeated them several times before their own decline, showing how frequently the balance of power shifted among the tribes. The Liburnians also became famous as skilled sailors and raiders. Their light and fast vessels were especially effective in the Adriatic, where speed was essential for piracy and coastal warfare. Their reputation became so strong that the Romans later used the name Liburnian for a type of light, fast warship of their own. Ancient tradition surrounded some of these peoples with dramatic stories of divine punishment. The Autariate were said to have joined Celtic groups in an expedition connected with an intended attack on the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. Before they could complete the sacrilege, violent storms, winds, and lightning supposedly struck them. The story continues with an even stranger disaster. After survivors returned home, enormous numbers of frogs were said to have appeared, contaminating rivers and streams as they died and decayed. Poisonous vapors then supposedly rose from the earth, producing a devastating epidemic that struck the Illyrians, and especially the Autariate. Unable to remain in their homeland, the survivors fled. The plague followed them, and neighboring peoples refused to accept them. After a long journey, they eventually reached an isolated marshy region associated with the Getae and settled near the Bastanae. The Celtic groups connected with the same sacrilegious expedition were also said to have suffered divine punishment. Earthquakes destroyed their settlements and forced them to migrate. Some entered Illyria, only to encounter communities already weakened by disease. After plundering the region, they themselves became affected and continued moving westward. Eventually, some of these migrating Celtic peoples reached as far as the Pyrenees. On their later return toward the east, they once again came into contact with Rome. Roman leaders, remembering earlier Celtic invasions of Italy, feared that another enormous force might cross the Alps. That fear contributed to one of the greatest Roman disasters of the late 2nd century BC. In 105 BC, Roman armies sent against the migrating Cimbri and their allies suffered catastrophic defeat. Panic spread throughout Italy, where memories of earlier Gallic invasions remained powerful. The crisis was eventually overcome through Gaius Marius. Already famous for his victories in North Africa, Marius was entrusted with command and went on to defeat the Cimbri and their allies in a series of decisive campaigns. What had seemed like a new threat to Italy was ultimately destroyed. Yet traditions of temple plundering in the Balkans did not end. Later, the Scordisci, Maedi, Dardani, and Celtic groups again moved into Macedonia and Greece, attacking sacred sites and carrying away wealth. Delphi itself once more became a target. By this time, Rome already controlled Macedonia and exercised immense influence in Greece. The destruction of sanctuaries, therefore, became another reason for intervention. Under Lucius Scipio, Roman forces campaigned against the tribes responsible for the raids. Neighboring peoples apparently refused to assist them, remembering older traditions about disasters that had followed sacrilege. Isolated from potential allies, the Scordisci suffered heavily. Many were killed, while survivors once again retreated toward the Danube and its islands. The Maedi and Dardani avoided complete destruction by reaching an agreement with Scipio. One ancient account claimed that part of the stolen sacred treasure was used to influence the Roman commander. Later writers even connected this corruption with the wider moral decline that supposedly helped produce Rome's future civil wars. For the Romans, Illyria eventually became a broad administrative and geographic term. They distinguished carefully between peoples such as the Pannonians, Ratians, Noricans, Moetians, and other Danubian populations, yet these groups could still be treated collectively within a larger Illyrian framework. This broad label was especially visible in Roman taxation. Peoples living across a vast area from the upper Danube toward the Black Sea could be grouped under a single fiscal category associated with Illyria. The name therefore became more than an ethnic description. It also became part of Roman administrative language. Rome's direct involvement on the Adriatic began more dramatically with Agron, king of a powerful Illyrian state along the coast. Under him, Illyrian naval power expanded rapidly. His forces gained influence over parts of Epirus and occupied important places including Corcyra, Epidamnus, and Pharus. As Agron's fleet became more aggressive, the Adriatic grew increasingly dangerous. The island of Issa appealed to Rome for assistance, hoping that the Republic could restrain Illyrian expansion and piracy. Rome sent representatives to investigate the dispute and determine what grievances Agron claimed against Issa. During the mission, however, Illyrian vessels attacked the delegation. One envoy from Issa and a Roman representative named Coruncanius were killed, while the others escaped. The murder of a Roman envoy was an enormous provocation. Rome now had a direct reason to intervene militarily. Roman forces crossed the Adriatic by both land and sea, beginning what became the First Illyrian War. Agron had died by this point, leaving behind a young son named Pinnes. Because the child was too young to rule, power passed into the hands of Agron's widow, who governed as regent even though she was not Pin's biological mother. The Illyrian position weakened almost immediately because of betrayal from within. Demetrius of Pharos, who had served Agron and controlled both Pharos and Corcyra, abandoned his former allies and surrendered these territories to Rome. Rome then established relations with Epidamnus and moved to assist communities threatened by Illyrian forces. Under increasing pressure, Illyrian armies abandoned several sieges and withdrew. The Atintani, one of the tribes involved, also switched sides and submitted to Rome. Recognizing that the war had turned against her, Agron's widow opened negotiations. She agreed to return Roman prisoners and deserters and attempted to distance herself from the actions that had caused the conflict, arguing that many of the earlier offenses had occurred under Agron. Rome imposed a restrictive settlement. Corcyra, Pharos, Issa, Epidamnus, and the Atintani were removed from direct Illyrian control. Pins was allowed to retain the remainder of the kingdom and could maintain friendly relations with Rome as long as he respected the new political arrangement. The naval terms were particularly important. Illyrian ships were forbidden from sailing south of Lissus in significant numbers. No more than 2 light vessels could pass beyond that point, and even these had to be unarmed. Rome was effectively limiting the ability of Illyrian rulers to project naval power farther down the Adriatic. The agreement marked Rome's first major military settlement with the Illyrians. Corcyra and Apollonia were given a degree of freedom under Roman protection, while Demetrius of Pharos received territories and fortifications as a reward for changing sides. The Romans never fully trusted him. His rewards were understood as temporary, and that suspicion soon proved justified. While Rome was occupied with a major war against the Gauls in northern Italy, Demetrius concluded that the Republic was too distracted to intervene in the Adriatic. He resumed aggressive maritime activity, brought the Istrians into his operations, and encouraged the Atintani to break away from Roman control. Once the Gallic War ended, Rome immediately turned back toward the Adriatic. A Roman fleet attacked the pirates and destroyed their ability to operate freely. The following year, Roman forces moved directly against Demetrius and his supporters. Demetrius fled to Philip V of Macedon, seeking protection at the Macedonian court. His escape would later contribute to closer ties between Macedon and anti-Roman forces in the region. When Demetrius later returned to piracy, Roman forces eventually killed him. His home city of Pharos, associated closely with his rebellion, was destroyed. Rome wanted to eliminate the center from which his resistance had been organized. The wider Illyrian population, however, was treated more leniently. Pins once again appealed to the Romans, and the Republic chose not to impose complete destruction on the remaining kingdom. The Second Illyrian War therefore ended much like the first. Rome had crossed the Adriatic to suppress a threat, defeated the leadership responsible, and then reorganized. The political situation rather than annexing everything directly. Yet these conflicts had much greater consequences than they first appeared to have. Rome was becoming permanently involved in the eastern Adriatic. What began as a response to piracy and the killing of an envoy opened the door to deeper Roman activity in Illyria, Greece, and eventually Macedonia itself. The Adriatic was no longer a distant frontier. It had become one of the main gateways through which Roman power would expand into the Balkans. The surviving accounts of Rome's dealings with the Illyrian peoples are difficult to arrange into one continuous chronology. A clearer way to understand the story is to follow the major tribes one by one, because Roman expansion into the Western Balkans developed through a long series of separate conflicts rather than a single uninterrupted war. One of the most important episodes came during Rome's struggle against Perseus of Macedon. In 168 BC, Gentius, king of an Illyrian people neighboring Macedonia, accepted money from Perseus and entered the war on his side. He attacked territories under Roman influence and took the dramatic step of arresting Roman envoys, claiming that they had entered his kingdom not as diplomats, but as spies. Rome responded immediately. The commander Lucius Anicius Gallus moved against Gentius by sea and captured several of his light warships before advancing inland. Roman forces then defeated the Illyrian king in battle and forced him to retreat into a fortified position. Realizing that resistance was collapsing, Gentius requested negotiations. Anicius gave him a simple condition. He would have to surrender himself completely to Rome. The king asked for 3 days to consider his position, but during that brief delay, many of his own subjects began abandoning him and transferring their loyalty to the Romans. With his support disappearing, Gentius returned and requested a personal meeting. He approached Anicius in complete submission, falling to his knees and begging for mercy. The Roman commander raised him from the ground, attempted to calm him, and even invited the defeated king to dine with him. The courtesy was temporary. Once the meal had ended, Anicius ordered his attendants to arrest Gentius and place him in custody. He was later taken to Rome together with his sons and displayed in the triumphal procession of the victorious commander. The entire campaign against him had lasted only about 20 days, an astonishingly rapid collapse for a kingdom that had recently dared to challenge Rome. The defeat of Gentius did not end with his personal capture. In 167 BC, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, fresh from his own victory over Perseus, traveled through the territory formally, controlled by the Illyrian king. Acting under instructions from the Senate, he approached 70 towns and offered what appeared to be a generous settlement. The inhabitants were told that Rome would forgive their resistance if they surrendered all of their gold and silver. Faced with Roman military superiority, they accepted the terms. Paulus then sent detachments to every town and carefully coordinated the operation so that all commanders would act on exactly the same day. At dawn, Roman officers announced that the population of each town had 3 hours to carry its money and valuables into the central marketplace. The residents obeyed, expecting this surrender to secure their safety. Once the 3-hour deadline had passed, the Roman troops received their real orders. They were allowed to seize whatever remained in the towns. In a carefully synchronized operation, 70 communities were stripped of their property almost simultaneously. The destruction demonstrated that Roman promises of leniency could coexist with extremely harsh punishment when the Senate wanted to make an example of defeated populations. Other Illyrian peoples soon came into conflict with Rome as well. The Ardii and Polari raided areas already under Roman control. Because Rome was occupied elsewhere, it initially responded diplomatically and sent envoys warning the tribes to stop. The warning was ignored. Rome then prepared a force of roughly 10,000 infantry and 600 cavalry. The Illyrians, realizing that a serious Roman expedition was being organized against them, quickly changed their position and sent representatives asking for forgiveness. The Senate demanded compensation for those who had suffered during the raids. When the tribes failed to provide it, the consul Fulvius Flaccus marched against them. The surviving record is frustratingly incomplete, and the campaign appears to have consisted primarily of destructive raids rather than a clearly documented final conquest. Farther north, Rome also fought the Lepides, who lived near the approaches to the Alps. Sempronius Tuditanus and Tiberius Pandusa campaigned against them in 129 BC and apparently forced them into submission. A similar result seems to have been achieved against the Segestani by Lucius Cotta and Metellus around 119 BC. Neither conquest proved permanent. Both peoples revolted again not long afterward, showing one of the central problems of Roman expansion in Illyria. Winning a campaign was often much easier than maintaining lasting control over scattered communities protected by mountains, forests, and difficult terrain. The Dalmatians became an even more persistent enemy. In 156 BC, they attacked Illyrian communities already subject to Rome. Roman envoys were sent to demand an explanation, but the Dalmatians refused even to receive them. Rome answered with war. The consul Marcius Figulus led an army into Dalmatian territory, expecting to impose Roman authority by force. The opening phase of the campaign, however, went badly. While Figulus was still establishing his camp, Dalmatian forces attacked unexpectedly. They overwhelmed the Roman guards and drove the entire army from its position. The retreat became chaotic, and Figulus was forced back across the countryside toward the river Naro. Winter was approaching, and the Dalmatians believed the danger had passed. They began returning to their homes, giving Figulus an opportunity to recover from the humiliation. He hoped to strike them before they could reorganize. The plan only partly succeeded. News of the renewed Roman advance spread quickly, and Dalmatian fighters gathered again from surrounding settlements. Figulus pressed forward anyway, and eventually forced them toward their principal stronghold, Delminium. The city occupied a naturally strong defensive position and was extremely difficult to assault. According to tradition, the broader name of the Dalmatians was connected with this important center. Figulus soon discovered that ordinary siege operations would not be enough to break its defenses. Roman siege engines were difficult to use effectively because of the elevation of the town. Direct assaults also produced little progress. Figulus therefore changed his strategy and attacked the surrounding settlements instead. Many of these communities had been partially abandoned because their defenders had concentrated inside Delminium. Roman troops captured them one after another, gradually isolating the main fortress and destroying the surrounding support network. Figulus eventually returned to Delminium with a more inventive method of attack. His troops prepared long pieces of wood covered with flax and coated in highly flammable materials such as pitch and sulfur. These were launched from artillery into the fortified settlement. As the burning projectiles moved through the air, the wind intensified the flames. When they landed on roofs and structures inside the city, fires spread rapidly. Large sections of Delminium were consumed, finally breaking the resistance that conventional assault had failed to overcome. The campaign ended with Roman victory, but Dalmatia remained far from permanently pacified. Several decades later, in 119 BC, Caecilius Metellus again campaigned there under very different circumstances. According to the hostile version of events preserved in the source, the Dalmatians had committed no major offense at the time. Metellus supposedly wanted a military command largely because a successful campaign would allow him to claim a triumph in Rome. The unusual nature of the expedition was reflected in the reception he received. Instead of treating Metellus as an invading enemy, the Dalmatians welcomed him peacefully. He even spent the winter among them at Salona. Despite the lack of a major war, Metellus later returned to Rome and received the triumph he had wanted. The episode reveals how personal ambition and Roman political competition could sometimes influence the decision to campaign beyond Italy. Illyrian resistance remained important even during the age of Julius Caesar. While Caesar commanded in Gaul, the Dalmatians and other powerful Illyrian groups seized Promona from the Liburnians. The Liburnians responded by placing themselves under Roman protection and appealing directly to Caesar. Because Roman authority was now closely connected with their position in the region, Caesar ordered the occupiers to return Promona. The demand was refused. Caesar therefore sent a substantial detachment of soldiers to enforce his order, but the result was disastrous. The Illyrians defeated the Roman force completely, destroying most or all of the expedition. Under normal circumstances, Caesar might have responded with a much larger, punitive campaign. Events elsewhere prevented him from doing so. His confrontation with Pompey was moving toward open civil war, leaving him no time to become trapped in another extended conflict in the Balkans. Once the civil war began, the Adriatic itself became strategically crucial. Caesar crossed from Brundisium during winter with the troops immediately available to him and began his campaign against Pompey in the Macedonian theatre. Reinforcements attempted to follow by different routes. Mark Antony crossed the Adriatic with another contingent despite the dangers of winter navigation. A separate force under Aulus Gabinius took the more difficult land route through Illyria. Gabinius commanded 15 cohorts of infantry and around 3,000 cavalry. His march brought him directly through territory inhabited by peoples who had already defeated Caesar's soldiers and had good reason to fear retaliation. The Illyrians understood the danger. If Caesar defeated Pompey and emerged as the ruler of the Roman world, they expected him to remember their earlier destruction of his forces. Rather than wait for that moment, They attacked Gabinius first. The result was another severe Roman disaster. Almost the entire force under Gabinius was destroyed. The commander himself escaped with only a small number of survivors, leaving behind enormous quantities of weapons, equipment, and other valuable spoils. The victory dramatically increased the wealth and confidence of the Illyrian tribes involved. For a time, their military strength reached one of its highest points. Roman armies had repeatedly entered the Balkans over the previous century, yet the region was still capable of producing enemies strong enough to destroy major Roman detachments. These episodes reveal why Illyria remained such a difficult frontier for Rome. There was no single Illyrian state whose defeat could end resistance everywhere. Instead, Rome faced dozens of independent peoples, each with its own leaders, interests, rivalries, and strongholds. Some tribes submitted and later revolted. Others cooperated with Rome against their neighbors. Coastal communities relied on naval power, while inland peoples used mountains and fortified settlements to resist Roman armies. Even after spectacular victories, Roman control could disappear as soon as troops were withdrawn. What began with interventions against piracy along the Adriatic had therefore developed into a much larger struggle for control of the Western Balkans. By the age of Caesar, Rome had fought there for generations, but the process of conquest was still unfinished. The final incorporation of Illyria would require new campaigns, larger armies, and decades of continued warfare. Julius Caesar had little opportunity to deal with the Illyrians, while the struggle against Pompey was still consuming his attention. Even after Pompey was dead, Caesar had to continue fighting scattered groups of his remaining supporters across the Roman world. Only after those conflicts had been brought under control did he return to Rome and begin preparing for new campaigns against the Getae and the Parthians. The Illyrians quickly realized that this could place them in danger. Caesar's planned route toward the east passed close to their territory, and they had good reason to fear punishment for earlier attacks on Roman forces. Rather than wait for an invasion, they sent representatives to Rome. The ambassadors apologized for what had happened and offered friendship and alliance, while proudly emphasizing the military strength and courage of their people. Caesar was already focused on the coming Parthian expedition, but he refused to simply forget the past. He told the Illyrians that Rome could not immediately treat as friends those who had attacked its armies. At the same time, he offered them a way out. If they accepted Roman authority, agreed to pay tribute, and handed over hostages as guarantees of their loyalty, he was prepared to forgive them. The Illyrian representatives accepted the conditions. Caesar then sent Publius Vatinius into the region with 3 legions and a substantial cavalry force. His task was not to carry out a massive conquest, but to collect a relatively moderate tribute and receive the promised hostages. Everything changed in 44 BC when Caesar was assassinated. Many of the Dalmatians concluded that Roman power in the region had depended almost entirely on Caesar personally, and that his death had destroyed the threat against them. They therefore refused to continue negotiations with Vatinius and rejected the demand for tribute. Vatinius attempted to enforce Roman authority by force, but the response was disastrous. Dalmatian fighters attacked his army and destroyed 5 Roman cohorts. Among those killed was Bibius, a commander of senatorial rank. Vatinius escaped with the remainder of his troops and withdrew to Epidamnus. Rome was too politically divided to respond effectively. The Senate transferred Vatinius's army, together with Macedonia and Roman-controlled Illyria, to Marcus Junius Brutus, one of Caesar's assassins. Syria was assigned to Cassius. But both men were soon absorbed in the far greater civil war against Mark Antony and Caesar's adopted heir, the future Augustus. Once again, the Illyrians benefited from Roman internal conflict. Farther north lived the Pannonians, whom Greek writers often associated with the Paeonians. Their territory extended along the Danube between peoples such as the Lapides and the Dardanians. Roman writers generally treated them as part of the broader Illyrian world, even though they recognized them as a distinct collection of tribes. Some groups connected with this region had already gained fame in the Macedonian era. The Agrianians, for example, had provided highly effective troops to Philip II and Alexander the Great. Their reputation showed that the peoples of the northern Balkans had long been important participants in the military politics of the region. Roman attempts to penetrate Pannonian territory did not always succeed. One early expedition under a commander named Cornelius ended so badly that the defeat created a lasting fear in Italy. For years afterward, Roman consuls were reportedly reluctant to lead another major campaign against the Pannonians. Even so, Rome had already acquired influence over parts of the wider Illyrian region before the age of Augustus. The exact process is not always clear, because surviving accounts concentrate much more heavily on the campaigns of Augustus himself than on the earlier stages of conquest. What is clear is that the Alpine and Balkan frontier remained incomplete. Roman armies had crossed the Alps many times on their way toward Gaul and Spain, yet numerous tribes living in the mountains had preserved their independence. They controlled narrow passes, raided neighboring territories, and were extremely difficult to subdue because of the terrain. Even Julius Caesar had never fully solved the problem. During his decade of campaigns in Gaul, he operated close to these regions and held authority over Roman Illyria. But the Gallic Wars and the later struggle with Pompey prevented him from devoting the necessary time and resources to a complete conquest of the Western Balkans. Augustus inherited this unfinished frontier. Once he had secured his position within the Roman world, he used military success in Illyria to emphasize the contrast between his own activity and the failures of his rivals. He claimed that Italy had repeatedly suffered from attacks by fierce neighboring peoples and that he had finally begun removing that danger. In 35 BC, Augustus launched a broad offensive against numerous tribes. Some were defeated quickly, including the Oxiae, Perthoneate, Batiate, Taulanti, Cambae, Sinambri, Meromene, and Pyrissae. Others required longer and more difficult campaigns, among them the Docleate, Carni, Interflorini, Neresi, Glintidiones, and Taurici. Many of these communities had previously resisted Roman taxation. Once conquered, they were forced to resume tribute payments. The rapid fall of several tribes also frightened neighboring peoples, including the Hippoceni and Bessi, who chose surrender rather than risk direct war with Augustus. Some communities were treated much more harshly. Island populations associated with Melite and Corcyra had revolted and continued to practice piracy. Augustus destroyed their resistance, killed many of the younger men, and sold other inhabitants into slavery. The Liburnians, also famous for maritime raiding, were deprived of their ships in order to reduce their ability to continue piracy. The Lapids became another major target. Some groups, such as the Moentini and Avendeatae, surrendered as soon as Augustus approached. The Arupini, however, were more numerous and more willing to fight. They abandoned their villages and concentrated in a fortified town. When Augustus entered the settlement, the defenders withdrew into the surrounding forests. He deliberately chose not to burn the town, hoping that restraint would persuade them to surrender. The strategy worked. The Arupini eventually submitted, and Augustus allowed them to return to their homes. The most difficult campaigns involved peoples such as the Selasi, the Transalpine Lapides, the Segestani, Dalmatians, Desitiots, and Pannonians. Their geographic separation, strong fortifications, and familiarity with mountain warfare made them much harder to defeat than communities living in more accessible territory. The Selasi occupied especially difficult alpine terrain. Their homeland contained steep mountains, narrow paths, and important routes used by travelers passing through the region. Because they controlled these passages, they had been able to remain independent and even demand tolls from those crossing their territory. A Roman commander named Vetus managed to surprise them and seize crucial mountain approaches. He then maintained pressure for approximately 2 years. The Selasi were eventually forced to surrender, largely because they were deprived of salt, a resource upon which they depended heavily. A Roman garrison was installed, but the submission did not last. As soon as Vetus left, the Selassie expelled the soldiers and regained control of the mountain passes. From their strong positions, they could resist later Roman forces and even mock attempts to dislodge them. Augustus temporarily chose compromise because a greater political confrontation with Mark Antony was approaching. Rather than become trapped in a difficult Alpine war, he recognized Selassian independence for the moment and overlooked their earlier resistance. The Selassie did not interpret this restraint as permanent peace. Suspicious of Roman intentions, they collected large reserves of salt and resumed raids into Roman territory. In 34 BC, Messala Corvinus was sent against them and finally forced their submission through a campaign that again relied heavily on hunger and the disruption of supplies. At roughly the same time, Augustus personally advanced against the Transalpine Lapids. These were strong and aggressive communities that had already driven Roman armies back twice within about 20 years. They had raided as far as Aquileia and attacked the Roman colony of Tegeste. The route into their country was brutally difficult. The Romans had to move along steep and narrow paths through heavily wooded mountains. The Lapides made the advance even harder by cutting down trees and blocking the road. Augustus anticipated ambushes. While the main army advanced through the lower ground, he sent additional forces along the ridges on both sides. These troops moved parallel to the column and cleared the surrounding woodland as they advanced. The Lapides eventually attacked from concealed positions in the forest. They wounded many Romans, but their ambush did not produce the result they expected. Roman soldiers controlling the higher ground attacked them from above and inflicted severe losses. The survivors withdrew deeper into the woods and abandoned a town called Turponus. Augustus occupied it, but again chose not to burn the settlement. He hoped that a controlled display of mercy would persuade the fugitives to submit. Once more the strategy succeeded. The inhabitants returned and accepted Roman authority, allowing Augustus to continue deeper into the region toward the most important Lapidian stronghold. That fortress was Metulum. It stood on a heavily wooded mountain divided into two ridges with a narrow valley running between them. Around 3,000 heavily armed defenders were concentrated there, and unlike several earlier communities, they were prepared for a determined siege. The first Roman assaults achieved little. The defenders repeatedly repelled troops approaching the walls and launched aggressive sorties against the Roman siege works. Day and night they attacked laborers constructing mounds and used artillery from the walls to disrupt the Roman camp. Some of the defensive equipment available to the inhabitants had apparently survived from earlier Roman civil wars in the region. The defenders therefore possessed enough military technology to make the siege far more difficult than Augustus may initially have expected. When part of the outer wall began to collapse, the inhabitants did not give up. Instead, they rapidly constructed a second line of defense inside the first. They abandoned the damaged outer wall and withdrew behind the new fortification. The Romans occupied the deserted section and burned it, but still faced another strong barrier. Augustus ordered the construction of two large siege mounds facing the new wall. From these positions, Roman engineers extended 4 temporary bridges toward the top of the fortifications. At the same time, part of the Roman army was sent toward the rear of the settlement to distract the defenders. Augustus himself climbed a high tower so that he could observe the assault and direct operations. The attack quickly became chaotic. Some Lapides met the Romans directly on the walls, while others positioned themselves beneath the bridges and stabbed upward with long spears. The unusual defense turned the Roman engineering advantage into a dangerous trap. One bridge collapsed under the fighting. Then another fell. When a third bridge also gave way, the Roman soldiers hesitated and refused to advance across the fourth. The momentum of the assault disappeared almost completely. Augustus reacted personally. He descended from the observation tower and angrily challenged the troops for refusing to continue. His words were not enough to move them. He then took a shield and ran toward the final bridge himself. A small number of senior officers followed, including Agrippa and several members of his personal guard. Their commander was now physically leading an assault that ordinary soldiers had become afraid to attempt. The effect was immediate. Ashamed to see Augustus exposing himself while they remained behind, large numbers of Roman soldiers rushed after him. But so many men crowded onto the bridge that the structure could not support their combined weight. The fourth bridge collapsed as well. Soldiers fell together into the space below. Some died immediately, while others suffered severe fractures and other injuries. Augustus himself was wounded in both arms and in his right leg. Even then, he understood that the psychological battle was just as important as the physical one. Rumors that he had been killed or seriously disabled could have destroyed Roman morale and encouraged the defenders. Despite his injuries, Augustus quickly returned to the tower carrying his insignia so that both armies could see that he was alive. He refused to allow the failed assault to appear like a retreat. New bridges were ordered almost immediately. The Romans began rebuilding the very structures that had just collapsed beneath them. For the defenders of Metulum, this persistence was deeply unsettling. They had destroyed the bridges, wounded Augustus, and thrown the assault into confusion, yet the Roman army was already preparing to attack again. What frightened them most was not a particular siege engine or formation. It was the realization that they were facing an enemy whose commander seemed unwilling to accept failure as a reason to stop. The defenders of Metulum had fought Augustus with remarkable determination, but after the collapse of the Roman assault bridges and the renewed preparations for another attack, they finally asked for terms. On the following day, they sent representatives to Augustus and agreed to hand over 50 hostages chosen personally by the Roman commander. They also accepted the presence of a Roman garrison inside the city. According to the arrangement, the Romans would occupy the higher of the two hills on which Metulum stood, while the inhabitants would remain on the lower one. For a moment, it seemed that the siege had ended without further bloodshed. That changed as soon as the Roman soldiers entered and demanded that the population surrender its weapons. The people of Metulum regarded disarmament as something very different from accepting a garrison. Believing that they were being stripped of their last means of defending themselves, they reacted with fury. The defenders made a desperate decision. Their wives and children were gathered inside the council building, while guards were placed around it with instructions to burn the structure if the battle went badly. The fighting men then armed themselves and launched one final attack against the Romans. Their position was hopeless. The Romans controlled the higher ground, while the Metulians had to advance uphill against soldiers who already occupied the stronger defensive position. Courage could not overcome the tactical disadvantage. Roman forces broke the attack and overwhelmed the defenders. Once it became clear that the battle was lost, the guards carried out their terrible orders and set fire to the council building. Ancient accounts describe scenes of extreme desperation inside. Some women killed their own children before taking their own lives, while others entered the flames still holding their children. By the end of the fighting, virtually the entire younger male population of Metulum had been killed, while much of the civilian population died in the fire. The city itself was consumed completely. What had once been one of the largest and most important settlements in the region was reduced so thoroughly that almost nothing remained. The destruction had exactly the psychological effect Rome wanted. Other Lepidian communities understood what continued resistance could bring and chose surrender rather than risk the same fate. For the first time, the Transalpine Lapids as a whole were brought firmly under Roman authority. Even this settlement was not completely secure. After Augustus left the region, a group called the Poseni revolted. Marcus Helvius was sent to restore order. He defeated them, executed the leaders of the uprising, and sold many of the remaining inhabitants into slavery. Roman control was expanding, but it still depended upon repeated demonstrations of force. Augustus then turned his attention towards the Segestani. Rome had already attempted to bring them under control on 2 earlier occasions, but those expeditions had failed to obtain hostages or any lasting submission. These previous successes had made the Segestani increasingly confident in their ability to resist Rome. To reach them, Augustus had to march through Pannonian territory that had not yet been fully conquered. Pannonia was heavily wooded and stretched across a broad zone between the Lepides and the Dardanians. Its population was scattered across villages and rural settlements, rather than concentrated in large urban centers. The Pannonians also lacked a single centralized political authority. Different communities were organized locally, often according to family or tribal connections, and there was no unified council or king capable of commanding the entire population. Ancient estimates claimed that they could produce as many as 100,000 fighting men, but their fragmented political structure made it difficult to assemble such numbers into one coordinated army. When Augustus entered their territory, many Pannonians avoided open battle. Instead, they disappeared into the forests and attacked isolated Roman soldiers or small groups that became separated from the main column. The terrain suited this kind of warfare perfectly. At first, Augustus showed restraint. He hoped the communities might voluntarily accept Roman authority, so he avoided destroying their villages and fields. When no surrender came, he abandoned that policy. For 8 days, Roman forces moved through the countryside, burning settlements, destroying crops, and devastating the territory along their route. Eventually, the army reached the lands of the Segestani. Their principal city, Segesta, stood on the river Sava and possessed formidable natural and artificial defenses. The river protected part of the settlement, while a large defensive ditch surrounded the rest. Augustus wanted the city for reasons that went far beyond defeating one local tribe. Segesta occupied an excellent strategic position for future Roman operations farther north and east. From there, Roman armies could potentially move toward the Dacians and Bastanae beyond the Danube. The waterways made the city even more valuable. The Sava connected with the Danube, allowing supplies to be transported toward future military fronts. Augustus therefore ordered ships to be constructed for carrying provisions through the river system. Segesta could become a major Roman military base in the interior of the Balkans. As Augustus approached, the Segestani sent representatives to discover exactly what he wanted. His demands were direct. Rome wanted the right to station a permanent garrison inside the city. He also required 100 hostages to guarantee the population's loyalty and enough food to support Roman operations. The leading men of Segesta were willing to accept these terms. The broader population was far less enthusiastic. They were particularly angry about the hostages, although they initially allowed the arrangement to proceed, perhaps because most of those selected came from prominent families rather than their own households. The situation changed when the Roman garrison actually approached the gates. Seeing foreign soldiers preparing to enter their city was more than the inhabitants could tolerate. The population turned against the agreement, closed the gates, occupied the walls, and prepared to resist. Augustus immediately began a formal siege. Roman engineers built a bridge across the river and surrounded Segesta with defensive trenches and wooden barriers, cutting the city off from the surrounding countryside. They also constructed 2 large siege mounds from which attacks could be launched against the walls. The Segestani resisted actively rather than simply waiting behind their defenses. They repeatedly launched attacks against the Roman siege works. When they could not capture the mounds directly, they threw burning material onto them in an attempt to destroy the structures by fire. Other Pannonian groups tried to come to Segesta's assistance. Augustus anticipated the relief force and prepared an ambush. When the reinforcements approached, Roman troops attacked unexpectedly, killing many and scattering the survivors. The defeat discouraged any further attempts to help the city. Segesta was now effectively alone. Even without outside assistance, the defenders continued fighting for a full month. They endured hunger, constant attacks, and the pressure of Roman siege machinery. Only on the 30th day did Roman forces finally break their resistance and take the city. Augustus was impressed by the determination of the defenders. Once victory had been secured, he chose not to destroy the population. Despite the long resistance, there was no mass execution or general deportation. Instead, The Segestani were fined and allowed to remain. Rome, however, made certain that the city could not simply rebel again. Part of Segesta was separated from the rest and transformed into a heavily defended Roman military zone. Augustus stationed a massive garrison there consisting of 25 cohorts. With the city secured, Augustus returned to Rome. His intention was to resume the Illyrian campaigns when the next campaigning season began. That plan changed when alarming reports arrived. According to rumor, the Segestani had risen again and massacred the Roman garrison. Augustus reacted immediately and hurried back toward the region despite the fact that it was winter. The reports turned out to be exaggerated, but they were not completely invented. A sudden uprising had indeed taken place, and the Roman soldiers had initially suffered serious losses because the attack caught them by surprise. The garrison recovered quickly. By the following day, the soldiers had reorganized, counterattacked, and crushed the rebellion before it could spread. When Augustus arrived, he discovered that Roman control of Segesta had survived. With the immediate danger removed, Augustus shifted his attention once again. The next target would be the Dalmatians, another powerful Illyrian people whose resistance had already caused Rome considerable difficulty. The campaigns against Metallum and Segesta revealed the pattern that would define Rome's conquest of the Balkans. Strongholds could resist for weeks, local populations could exploit forests and mountains, and surrender did not always guarantee permanent obedience. Augustus therefore combined military violence, hostage-taking, strategic garrisons, and occasional clemency to establish control. The result was not yet complete conquest, but Roman power was steadily moving deeper into the interior. Every captured fortress, secured river route, and defeated tribe made the next campaign easier. What had once been a dangerous frontier along the Adriatic was gradually becoming part of a much larger Roman military system extending toward the Danube. The Dalmatians had remained defiant for years after their destruction of 5 Roman cohorts under Gabinius. That victory had given them enormous confidence, especially because they had also captured Roman military standards, symbols whose loss carried deep humiliation for Rome. For nearly a decade, they continued to resist without laying down their weapons. When Augustus finally prepared a major campaign against them, the Dalmatian communities responded by forming a common defensive alliance. Together they could field more than 12,000 fighting men, and they selected a commander named Vasus to lead them. One of their most important positions was Promona, a settlement that had once belonged to the Liburnians. Vasus occupied it again and strengthened its defenses. The location was already naturally formidable. Promona stood on mountainous terrain surrounded by steep, jagged hills, creating a defensive system that gave the Dalmatians a clear advantage over any army approaching from below. Most of the Dalmatian force remained inside the settlement, while detachments occupied the surrounding heights. From these positions they could observe Roman movements and attack from above. Augustus initially appeared to be preparing a conventional blockade, beginning the construction of fortifications designed to isolate the entire position. Behind this visible operation, however, he organized a more dangerous plan. A selected group of experienced soldiers was secretly sent through the wooded terrain to search for a hidden route toward the highest of the surrounding hills. The maneuver succeeded. Moving under cover, the Roman troops reached the position during the night and surprised the Dalmatian guards while they were sleeping. The defenders were killed, and as dawn approached, the Romans signaled to Augustus that the height had been secured. Augustus immediately exploited the breakthrough. While the main army advanced toward Promona, additional Roman detachments climbed the captured hill and then began moving downward toward the neighboring heights. The Dalmatians suddenly found themselves threatened from several directions at once. The effect was devastating. Men stationed on the surrounding hills realized that their positions could soon become isolated. Their greatest concern was water. If Roman troops cut them off from the routes leading to their supplies, holding the heights would become impossible. One after another, the defenders abandoned their positions and withdrew inside Promona. Augustus now began surrounding the settlement and the two remaining enemy-held hills with a massive line of fortifications. The planned enclosure stretched for roughly 40 stads and was designed to prevent both escape and reinforcement. Help nevertheless approached. A Dalmatian commander named Testimus brought another force in an attempt to relieve Promona. Augustus intercepted him before he could reach the town and drove his soldiers back towards the mountains. The siege ended before the Roman encirclement was even completed. The defenders made a sortie from Promona, hoping to break the pressure around the settlement, but Roman forces drove them back violently. Instead of stopping at the walls, the Romans pursued them through the entrances and forced their way into the town. Fighting continued inside Promona, where approximately a third of the defenders were killed. The survivors retreated into the citadel and prepared to make another stand. Augustus placed a Roman cohort at the entrance to prevent them from escaping. 4 nights later, the remaining Dalmatians launched a surprise assault against this position. The Roman cohort panicked and abandoned the gate. Augustus personally intervened before the retreat could develop into a larger disaster and stopped the enemy breakthrough. The following day, the defenders surrendered. Augustus responded harshly to the Roman soldiers who had deserted their position. The cohort was forced to draw lots, and every 10th man was executed according to the traditional punishment known as decimation. 2 centurions were also put to death. Those who survived were not immediately forgiven. For the remainder of the summer, they were ordered to live on barley rather than wheat, another humiliating disciplinary punishment. Augustus wanted the army to understand that cowardice in front of the enemy could be punished almost as severely as rebellion itself. The fall of Promona destroyed the immediate Dalmatian defensive plan. Testimonials recognized that he could no longer maintain a concentrated army and ordered his men to disperse in every direction. This created a new problem for the Romans. Pursuing scattered fighters through unfamiliar mountains was dangerous. Roman troops could easily become separated into small units and fall into ambushes, while the many overlapping tracks of retreating soldiers made it difficult to determine which direction the main groups had taken. Augustus continued advancing carefully. His forces captured Synodium, located near the forested region where the army of Gabinius had previously been trapped and destroyed. The memory of that Roman disaster made the area especially dangerous. The terrain included a long, narrow gorge running between 2 mountains, exactly the kind of place where a marching army could be attacked from above and cut apart. Dalmatian forces again attempted to use the landscape for an ambush. Augustus had learned from the earlier catastrophe. Before moving his main column through the gorge, he sent troops along the mountain ridges on both sides. These forces advanced parallel to the army below, preventing the Dalmatians from freely occupying the heights. The Romans also cut down trees as they moved, destroying hiding places and opening the terrain around their route. Settlements encountered along the advance were captured and burned, while anything that could support further resistance was systematically destroyed. The campaign eventually reached Setovia. Augustus began besieging the city, but another Dalmatian force appeared and attempted to relieve it. Roman troops intercepted the attackers and prevented them from entering the settlement. During the fighting, Augustus was struck in the knee by a stone. The wound temporarily removed him from active campaigning, and he was unable to continue operations for several days. After recovering enough to travel, he returned to Rome to fulfill his responsibilities as consul alongside Vulcatius Tullus. Command in Dalmatia was temporarily left to Stotilius Taurus, who was instructed to continue the campaign. At the beginning of 33 BC, Augustus formally entered his new consulship. He transferred the office almost immediately to Autronius Paetus and returned to Dalmatia without delay. He still possessed the extraordinary authority of the triumvirate, whose second 5-year term had not yet expired. By the time he returned, the situation of the Dalmatians had deteriorated badly. Roman operations had disrupted their access to food and foreign supplies, while repeated defeats had made continued resistance increasingly difficult. Rather than face another season of war, Dalmatian representatives approached Augustus on the road and asked for peace. This time their surrender was comprehensive. Augustus demanded 700 children as hostages to guarantee future obedience. The Dalmatians also returned the Roman standards captured from Gabinius years earlier. Recovering these symbols had enormous political and emotional importance for Rome, turning an old humiliation into a demonstration of restored honor. The Dalmatians additionally agreed to pay tribute that had remained unpaid since the period of Julius Caesar. From this point, they accepted Roman authority and ceased organized resistance against Augustus. The recovered standards were taken back to Rome and displayed in the portico of Octavia, where their public exhibition celebrated the reversal of the earlier Roman defeat. With Dalmatia subdued, Augustus continued against the Debani. They chose not to repeat the Dalmatian experience. Their representatives approached him peacefully, asked for forgiveness, surrendered hostages, and agreed to pay overdue tribute. Other tribes followed the same pattern as Augustus moved through the region. The mere approach of Roman forces was increasingly enough to produce surrender. Communities handed over hostages and accepted treaties rather than risk siege, destruction, or enslavement. Illness prevented Augustus from personally reaching every remaining group. Those he could not visit provided neither hostages nor formal agreements at that time, although they were eventually brought under Roman authority as well. By the end of these campaigns, Augustus had accomplished something earlier Roman commanders had repeatedly failed to achieve. He had not merely restored control over territories that had revolted. He had pushed Roman power into communities that had never previously accepted Roman rule. The conquest fundamentally changed the Western Balkans. The region that had once produced pirates, raiders, mountain warriors, and armies capable of destroying entire Roman detachments was increasingly absorbed into Rome's political and military system. The Senate rewarded Augustus with the honor of an Illyrian triumph. He would eventually celebrate that achievement alongside the greater triumphs connected with his victory over Mark Antony. The importance of the campaign went far beyond ceremony. Roman control of Dalmatia and the surrounding Illyrian territories strengthened Italy's northeastern frontier, secured crucial Adriatic routes, and opened the way toward the Danube. Augustus had transformed a region that had troubled Rome for generations into one of the foundations of Roman power in the Balkans. Beyond the peoples already brought under Roman authority, several other populations were included within the broad geographical world that Rome associated with Illyria. Among them were the Ratians and Noricans, living beyond the Alpine frontier near Pannonia, as well as the Mysians farther east, whose territories extended toward the Black Sea. The exact circumstances surrounding the Roman conquest of the Ratians and Noricans were not always clear to ancient historians. Their land stood between the regions transformed by Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul and the territories later attacked during the wars of Augustus in the Balkans. Because no distinct early campaign against them was recorded in this account, it was possible to assume that their submission occurred as part of Rome's wider expansion into neighboring territories. The Mysians had a somewhat clearer connection with Roman military history. One important expedition was led by Marcus Licinius Lucullus, the brother of the more famous Lucullus, who fought against Mithridates VI of Pontus. His campaign carried Roman forces eastward through the Balkans toward the western shores of the Black Sea. In the course of the expedition, Lucullus reached a region containing several important Greek cities situated near Mysian territory. These included Istros, Dionysopolis, Odessus, Mesembria, Calatis, and Apollonia. These coastal communities formed part of a much older Greek presence around the Black Sea and occupied strategically valuable positions between the Mediterranean world and the peoples of the Balkan interior. One of the most memorable results of Lucullus's campaign came from Apollonia. The city possessed a celebrated monumental statue of Apollo, and Lucullus carried this enormous work back to Rome as part of the spoils of victory. It was later displayed on the Palatine Hill, transforming a monument from a distant Black Sea city into a visible symbol of Roman expansion. Despite this expedition, the Mysians were not immediately incorporated into a regular Roman system of taxation. Their relationship with Rome continued to develop gradually, rather than through a single decisive act of conquest. Even during the reign of Augustus, they had not yet been subjected to the regular tribute associated with full Roman domination. That change came under his successor, Tiberius. Under the imperial government, Roman control over the region became more systematic, and the Mysians were finally incorporated more firmly into the administrative structure of the empire. Their story therefore illustrates the gradual character of Roman expansion in the Balkans. Military expeditions could occur decades before permanent provincial administration followed. A Roman army might defeat local powers, seize strategic cities, or carry away valuable spoils without immediately turning the entire region into a fully organized Roman possession. The same pattern can be seen throughout Illyria. Roman domination did not emerge from one great conquest. It developed through generations of warfare, diplomacy, revolts, punitive expeditions, alliances, tribute arrangements, and the establishment of military garrisons. By the beginning of the imperial period, however, the transformation was becoming permanent. Territories stretching from the Adriatic and the Alps toward Pannonia, the Danube, and the Black Sea were increasingly connected within a Roman political and military system. What had once been a vast frontier occupied by independent tribes, mountain communities, coastal raiders, and powerful local kingdoms was gradually becoming part of the Roman imperial world. The campaigns of Republican generals such as Lucullus had opened the way, while Augustus and Tiberius completed much of the transition from temporary military influence to lasting imperial control. Antiochus III ruled a vast Seleucid realm stretching across much of the ancient Near East. He belonged to the dynasty founded by Seleucus I, one of Alexander the Great's successors, and inherited a kingdom that still claimed authority over territories extending from Syria and Mesopotamia deep into Asia. Yet by the time Antiochus came to power, several distant regions had slipped away from Seleucid control. Determined to restore the strength of his dynasty, he launched a series of ambitious campaigns that would eventually earn him the title Antiochus the Great. Much of his early reign was devoted to rebuilding Seleucid influence in the east. Antiochus campaigned in Media, Parthia, and other territories that had broken away from his predecessors. These expeditions greatly strengthened his reputation and allowed him to present himself not simply as another Seleucid monarch, but as the restorer of an empire. His victories encouraged even greater ambitions. Rather than being satisfied with recovering lost eastern lands, Antiochus began looking toward the wealthy and strategically important regions of the eastern Mediterranean. One of his major targets was the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. Taking advantage of the weakness of the young Ptolemaic ruler, Antiochus expanded into Coele Syria and parts of Cilicia, territories that had long been disputed between the Seleucid and Ptolemaic dynasties. Success there convinced him that the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean was shifting in his favor. His ambition soon carried him farther west, toward the Greek cities along the coast of Asia Minor and eventually toward Europe itself. Antiochus considered many of the Greek communities of Western Asia Minor to lie naturally within the Seleucid sphere of influence. Some of these cities had once been controlled by earlier Hellenistic kings, and he used this historical connection to justify his claims over them. He therefore advanced toward the Hellespont and placed increasing pressure on the Greek cities of Aeolis and Ionia. Some communities accepted his authority, whether willingly or because resistance appeared hopeless, while others refused to surrender their independence. His expansion did not stop at the Asian shore. Antiochus crossed into Europe and moved into Thrace, where he sought to restore Seleucid authority over territory that he believed had once belonged to his dynasty. Communities that resisted were forced into submission, while important strategic positions were strengthened. His presence in Thrace was more than a temporary military expedition. Antiochus clearly intended to establish a permanent Seleucid base in Europe. At the center of this strategy stood Lysimachia. The city had originally been founded by Lysimachus, another of Alexander's successors, as a major stronghold controlling the region around the Thracian Chersonese. After Lysimachus died, however, the city suffered heavily and eventually declined. Antiochus recognized its strategic importance and decided to restore it on a large scale. The reconstruction of Lysimachia was carefully organized. Former inhabitants were encouraged to return, people who had been carried away or sold into slavery were recovered, and new settlers were brought into the city. Antiochus also provided practical resources needed to rebuild the surrounding economy, including livestock and agricultural equipment. His goal was not merely to repair ruined buildings. He wanted to create a functioning city capable of supporting a military presence and serving as a permanent center of Seleucid power. Its location made Lysimachia especially valuable. From there, Antiochus could watch over Thrace, maintain influence near the Hellespont, and secure an important route between Asia and Europe. The city could also provide supplies for future campaigns. In effect, Antiochus was constructing a bridgehead from which Seleucid power could operate on the European side of the Aegean. These developments inevitably attracted Roman attention. Rome had recently defeated Philip V of Macedon and had become deeply involved in Greek affairs. The Romans were presenting themselves as defenders of the freedom of Greek cities, while Antiochus was extending his authority over some of those same communities. Their interests were beginning to collide, even though neither side had yet openly declared the other an enemy. Several Greek cities became caught between the two powers. Many accepted Antiochus and allowed Seleucid garrisons inside their walls, fearing what might happen if they resisted his army. Smyrna and Lampsacus, however, were among the communities that continued to oppose him. Unable to confront Antiochus alone, they appealed to Rome for assistance. Their requests reached Titus Quinctius Flaminius, the Roman commander whose victory over Philip V had transformed Rome into a dominant political force in Greece. Roman diplomacy now extended far beyond Italy, and the complaints of the Greek cities gave Rome a reason to question Antiochus directly. Messages and diplomatic missions began passing between the Roman representatives and the Seleucid king, but neither side was willing to abandon its position. Behind these diplomatic exchanges lay growing suspicion. Roman leaders watched Antiochus with increasing concern. His campaigns had restored Seleucid influence across large parts of Asia. His armies had reached the Aegean, and now he was establishing himself in Thrace. From the Roman perspective, a powerful king who continued expanding westward could eventually threaten the political settlement Rome had created after defeating Macedonia. Antiochus had similar reasons to distrust Rome. He understood that Roman power had expanded dramatically and that Rome was becoming the greatest obstacle to further Seleucid expansion toward the west. As long as Rome remained involved in Greece and the Aegean, Antiochus could not extend his influence there without risking confrontation. The two powers were therefore watching one another carefully, each attempting to determine how far the other intended to go. Another dispute soon gave Rome an opportunity to intervene more directly. The Ptolemaic government complained that Antiochus had seized territories in Syria and Cilicia that belonged to Egypt. Rome responded by sending representatives to Antiochus. Officially, their mission was presented as an attempt to settle the disagreement between the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kingdoms. In reality, the Romans also wanted to discover Antiochus's wider intentions and place limits on his expansion. The Roman envoys demanded important concessions. They argued that territories inherited by the Ptolemaic ruler should be restored to him. They also insisted that Greek cities in Asia Minor that had previously belonged to Philip V should remain independent rather than simply passing from Macedonian domination into Seleucid control. Rome had fought Philip and weakened his position in the region, and Roman leaders were unwilling to watch Antiochus take possession of the territories that Philip had lost. The Romans were particularly suspicious of Antiochus's activities in Europe. They questioned why a king whose main territories lay far to the east had brought powerful military and naval forces toward the Aegean, crossed into Thrace, rebuilt a major fortified city, and established himself so close to Greece. To Roman observers, these actions looked less like the recovery of old possessions and more like preparations for another major expansion. Antiochus rejected this interpretation. He maintained that Thrace was not a new conquest in the sense claimed by the Romans. According to his argument, the region had previously belonged to his ancestors and had only been lost because earlier Seleucid rulers had been occupied with conflicts elsewhere. Now that circumstances allowed it, he was simply restoring territory that rightfully belonged to his dynasty. He also explained that the reconstruction of Lysimachia had a dynastic purpose. Antiochus intended the city to become an important center for his son Seleucus, strengthening the future position of the royal family in the region. From his perspective, Rome had no legitimate reason to interfere with what he considered an internal matter concerning traditional Seleucid possessions. The question of the Greek cities remained equally contentious. Antiochus was willing to speak of granting them freedom, but he insisted that their independence must come through his own decision. He had no intention of allowing Rome to claim responsibility for liberating cities situated within what he regarded as his sphere of authority. If those communities were to enjoy autonomy, he wanted them to recognize Antiochus himself as the ruler who had granted it. This disagreement revealed a much larger struggle developing beneath the diplomatic language. The conflict was no longer simply about individual cities, disputed provinces, or the reconstruction of Lysimachia. Rome and Antiochus were advancing two competing visions of power in the eastern Mediterranean. Antiochus sought to revive the imperial reach of the Seleucid monarchy, while Rome increasingly believed that no major political change in Greece or the Aegean should take place without Roman approval. For the moment, both sides continued to negotiate rather than fight. Yet their interests were becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. Antiochus saw his campaigns as the legitimate restoration of Seleucid authority, while Rome saw the same expansion as a potential threat to the political order it had recently established. The rivalry had not yet become an open war, but the foundations of the coming confrontation between Rome and Antiochus the Great were already firmly in place. Antiochus defended his position by reminding the Roman representatives that he had close ties with the Ptolemaic dynasty. He was related to Ptolemy and expected soon to become connected to him through marriage, so he argued that any disputes between their kingdoms could be handled without Roman supervision. More importantly, Antiochus openly questioned Rome's authority to involve itself in Asian politics. He pointed out that he did not attempt to dictate events in Italy and saw no reason why Rome should determine what a Seleucid king could or could not do in Asia. Neither side was willing to compromise, and the meeting ended with the disagreement more serious than before. What had begun as cautious diplomacy was rapidly turning into an open rivalry. Soon afterward, a report circulated that Ptolemy had died. Antiochus immediately recognized the opportunity that such a succession crisis might create and moved toward Egypt, hoping to take advantage of the kingdom before a stable government could be established. During this journey, however, an unexpected figure entered his court. Hannibal, the famous Carthaginian commander, who had once brought Rome closer to destruction than almost any other enemy in its history. Hannibal was now living in exile. Political enemies in Carthage had accused him of continuing to encourage resistance against Rome and portrayed him as a man incapable of accepting the peace imposed after the Second Punic War. Because Carthage remained bound by treaty and operated under heavy Roman pressure, these accusations placed Hannibal in an increasingly dangerous position. Eventually, he abandoned his homeland and sought protection elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Antiochus encountered Hannibal at Ephesus and welcomed him with extraordinary respect. Hannibal's reputation still carried enormous weight. He had crossed the Alps, destroyed Roman armies, spent years campaigning in Italy, and demonstrated a remarkable understanding of Roman military strengths and weaknesses. To a king increasingly likely to face Rome in war, such a man was an invaluable advisor. Antiochus therefore kept Hannibal close and treated him as an important member of his circle. The expedition toward Egypt soon lost its purpose when Antiochus reached Lycia and discovered that the report of Ptolemy's death was false. Rather than continuing toward Egypt, he changed his plans and turned his attention to Cyprus. Yet this operation also suffered a serious setback. Near the mouth of the Sarus River, his fleet was struck by a violent storm. Ships were lost, along with soldiers and members of his entourage, forcing Antiochus to abandon the immediate expedition and sail to Seleucia in Syria to repair the damaged vessels. While there, Antiochus turned his attention to dynastic affairs and celebrated the marriage of two of his children, Antiochus and Laodice. Such marriages were more than family ceremonies in the Hellenistic world. They formed part of a broader political system in which royal families used marriage to secure alliances, reduce potential threats, and strengthen their position before major conflicts. By 193 BC, Antiochus was preparing more seriously for the possibility of war with Rome. Instead of concealing his intentions, he began building a network of alliances among neighboring kingdoms. Marriage became one of his principal diplomatic tools. His goal was clear: stabilize the regions around his empire and surround himself with rulers whose interests would be tied to his own before confronting the most powerful state in the Western Mediterranean. One of his daughters, Cleopatra Syra, was given in marriage to Ptolemy of Egypt. Antiochus offered Coele-Syria as part of the marriage arrangement, despite having previously taken the region from the Ptolemaic kingdom. The gesture was politically useful. By strengthening his relationship with Egypt, Antiochus hoped to prevent the young Ptolemaic ruler from creating trouble while Seleucid forces were occupied with Rome. Another daughter, Antiochus, was married to Ariarathes of Cappadocia. Antiochus also attempted to establish a marriage alliance with Eumenes, king of Pergamum. Eumenes, however, refused the proposal. His decision surprised those around him because Antiochus was a powerful neighboring monarch, and a family connection with the Seleucid dynasty appeared, at first glance, to offer enormous advantages. Eumenes explained his reasoning to his brothers Attalus and Philetaerus. He believed the coming conflict between Rome and Antiochus would initially be difficult to predict, but he ultimately expected Rome to win. Roman determination, military discipline, and ability to continue fighting after setbacks convinced him that Antiochus would eventually be defeated. For Eumenes, accepting the marriage could therefore place Pergamum on the wrong side of a dangerous struggle. His calculation went even further. If Rome won, Eumenes believed cooperation with the Romans could strengthen his throne and perhaps increase his influence. If Antiochus won, however, the situation might actually become worse for Pergamum. A victorious Seleucid king living directly beside his kingdom could seize its territories or leave Eumenes on the throne only as a subordinate. From that perspective, marriage to Antiochus's family offered little real security. Eumenes therefore rejected the alliance and increasingly placed his hopes in Rome. Meanwhile, Antiochus continued strengthening his position near Europe. He returned to the Hellespont, crossed into the Chersonese, and extended his authority over much of Thrace. Some territories submitted voluntarily, while others were brought under his control through military action. His presence in the region was becoming increasingly permanent, further alarming Roman leaders who had already warned him against expanding into Europe. Antiochus also attempted to win support among the Greeks living in the area. Communities that had previously suffered under Thracian domination were freed, allowing him to portray Seleucid expansion as liberation rather than simple conquest. At the same time, he cultivated friendly relations with Byzantium, whose location made it exceptionally important. Situated near the entrance to the Black Sea, the city controlled one of the most valuable strategic and commercial passages in the ancient Mediterranean world. He also secured the cooperation of the Galatians. Antiochus valued them especially for their military potential, and believed their physical strength and reputation as warriors would make them useful in the approaching conflict. Through diplomacy, gifts, intimidation, and military pressure, he was gradually constructing a broader coalition that could support his operations against Rome. From Ephesus, Antiochus sent Lysias, Agesianax, and Menippus as ambassadors to Rome. Publicly, their mission was diplomatic. Privately, Antiochus wanted them to determine how far the Senate was prepared to go. He needed to know whether Rome was merely applying political pressure or whether it was genuinely willing to fight over the freedom of the Greek cities and Seleucid expansion into Thrace. Menippus presented Antiochus's position before the Romans. The Seleucid king, he explained, was willing to maintain friendly relations with Rome and even become its ally. Yet Rome's demands did not sound like the requests of an equal partner. The Romans were telling Antiochus to abandon claims over Ionian cities, release certain communities from tribute, avoid interfering in parts of Asia, and withdraw from Thrace. From Antiochus's perspective, these were not friendly suggestions. They sounded like conditions imposed by a victorious power upon a defeated enemy. The Roman Senate responded with equal firmness. If Antiochus wanted Roman friendship, he should recognize the independence of the Greek cities in Asia Minor and remove himself from European affairs. Rome offered little further justification. The message was deliberately simple. Antiochus could remain a friend of Rome, but only if his expansion stopped where Roman interests began. With diplomacy producing no meaningful settlement, Antiochus began considering how a war should actually be fought. His initial plan centered on Greece. He intended to enter the Greek world and use it as the starting point for operations against Rome. Before committing himself, however, he discussed the strategy with Hannibal, whose experience against the Romans was unmatched among the king's advisors. Hannibal believed Antiochus was approaching the problem from the wrong direction. Greece, weakened by decades of warfare, might be relatively easy to enter, but occupying it would not defeat Rome. The Romans would still be fighting away from their own vulnerable population centers while receiving food, soldiers, money, and equipment from Italy. As long as Rome's homeland remained secure, Hannibal believed the Republic could survive setbacks abroad and continue sending new armies into the field. The decisive struggle, Hannibal argued, had to be carried into Italy itself. A war fought on Roman soil would force Rome to defend its own communities, disrupt agriculture, stretch military resources, and create fear among its allies. Hannibal knew this from personal experience. During the Second Punic War, his presence in Italy had forced Rome to devote enormous resources to defending the peninsula, even while fighting elsewhere. Hannibal proposed an audacious plan. Give him around 10,000 troops, he suggested, and he could return to Italy, seize strategically important positions, and reconnect with supporters in Carthage. His return to Italian soil might also transform the political situation in North Africa. Many Carthaginians remained bitter about the restrictions imposed by Rome, and the appearance of Hannibal at the head of a new army could revive hopes that Roman dominance might finally be challenged. For Antiochus, the possibility of bringing Carthage into the conflict was extremely attractive. Carthage still possessed wealth, manpower, maritime experience, and a deep resentment of Rome. If Hannibal could provoke a Carthaginian uprising while Seleucid forces threatened Roman interests elsewhere, Rome could be forced to confront several crises simultaneously. Antiochus therefore responded enthusiastically and instructed Hannibal to contact his supporters. Hannibal, however, understood that the moment was dangerous. He refused to send ordinary letters directly to Carthage because Roman agents were watching political developments closely. War between Antiochus and Rome had not yet officially begun, and Hannibal still had powerful enemies in his homeland who would eagerly expose any conspiracy connected to him. Carthaginian politics were also deeply divided, making secrecy extremely difficult. Instead, Hannibal relied on a Tyrian merchant named Aristo. Traveling under the appearance of normal commercial business, Aristo entered Carthage and quietly contacted Hannibal's allies. His message was straightforward. They should be prepared for the possibility that Hannibal would return to Italy, and if that happened, Carthage should be ready to rise against Rome and avenge the humiliation it had suffered. The mission did not remain secret for long. Hannibal's opponents discovered that Aristo was operating in the city, and immediately suspected a conspiracy. Rumors of revolution spread through Carthage, and authorities began searching for the merchant. The situation threatened not only Aristo himself, but also Hannibal's supporters, who could easily be accused of participating in a secret plot against Rome. Aristo responded with a clever political maneuver. During the night, he secretly placed written notices near the Senate House, claiming that Hannibal's appeal had been addressed not to a small group of conspirators, but to the entire Carthaginian Senate. By making the message appear general rather than private, he made it far more difficult to identify individual supporters as members of a hidden faction. After arranging this deception, Aristo escaped from the city by sea. The strategy protected Hannibal's friends from immediate exposure, but it did nothing to calm Carthage itself. The city remained deeply unsettled. Many Carthaginians resented Roman domination and remembered the losses imposed upon them after defeat, yet they also understood how dangerous another confrontation would be. Anger toward Rome existed alongside fear, uncertainty, and political division. By this point, the Mediterranean was moving steadily toward another major war. Antiochus was expanding his alliances and strengthening his position around the Aegean. Rome was refusing to tolerate Seleucid intervention in Europe. Eumenes of Pergamum had calculated that his future depended on Roman victory, while Hannibal was trying to turn Antiochus's conflict into something far larger by carrying war back to Italy and possibly drawing Carthage into rebellion. The struggle that had begun with diplomatic arguments over Greek cities was rapidly developing into a confrontation that could reshape the balance of power across the Mediterranean. In 192 BC, while relations between Rome and Antiochus were becoming increasingly tense, the Romans sent another diplomatic mission eastward. Among the representatives was Scipio Africanus, the commander whose victory at Zama had ended Hannibal's campaign against Rome and shattered Carthage's position as a great Mediterranean power. Much like the envoys previously sent by Antiochus, the Romans were interested in more than formal negotiations. They wanted to discover what the Seleucid king was planning, measure the strength of his forces, and determine whether his preparations were leading toward war. When the Roman delegation learned that Antiochus had traveled into Pisidia, they remained at Ephesus and waited for his return. There they found Hannibal, now one of the most famous exiles in the Mediterranean world. Officially, Rome and Antiochus were not yet at war, while Carthage remained bound to Rome by the peace settlement imposed after the Second Punic War. This created the unusual situation in which Roman representatives could speak openly with the man who had once been their most dangerous enemy. The Romans began meeting Hannibal frequently. Their conversations appeared friendly, and they questioned him about his decision to leave Carthage. They pointed out that Rome had not recently taken any direct action against him that violated its treaty with the Carthaginians, suggesting that his decision to flee had been unnecessary. Yet the Romans were not simply interested in discussing Hannibal's personal circumstances. Their friendliness served a much more calculated purpose. By repeatedly appearing in public conversation with Hannibal, the Roman envoys hoped to make Antiochus suspicious of his famous advisor. If the Seleucid king saw Hannibal speaking comfortably and regularly with Roman representatives, he might begin wondering whether the Carthaginian could still be trusted. It was a subtle form of political warfare, requiring no army and no formal accusation. The Romans simply created the appearance of familiarity and allowed suspicion to develop on its own. For all his brilliance on the battlefield, Hannibal apparently failed to recognize the danger immediately. Antiochus, however, heard about the repeated meetings and began questioning Hannibal's loyalty. From that point onward, the king became less willing to share his plans with him and less inclined to rely fully on his advice. The Roman maneuver had achieved exactly what it was intended to accomplish. There may also have been a personal element behind Antiochus' distrust. Hannibal's reputation was enormous, and his presence at the Seleucid court could easily overshadow the king himself. Antiochus was preparing for a conflict in which he hoped to demonstrate his own greatness. If Hannibal became the architect of victory over Rome, much of the glory might belong to the Carthaginian rather than to Antiochus. Suspicion therefore mixed with rivalry, pride, and perhaps a degree of jealousy. During this period at Ephesus, tradition places one of the most memorable encounters between two commanders of the ancient world. Scipio Africanus and Hannibal are said to have met in a gymnasium, where their conversation turned toward the question of military greatness. A number of people were supposedly present when Scipio asked his former enemy, whom he regarded as the greatest general in history. Hannibal answered without hesitation, "Alexander the Great." The Macedonian conqueror had destroyed the Persian Empire and carried his armies from Greece and Egypt deep into Asia, creating an empire of extraordinary size before his death. Scipio accepted the answer without argument. Alexander's position at the top of such a ranking was difficult to challenge. Scipio then asked who deserved second place. Hannibal chose Pyrrhus of Epirus, another commander famous for his aggressive style of warfare and willingness to take enormous risks. Hannibal admired boldness as one of the essential qualities of successful command, and in his view, few rulers had demonstrated greater daring than Alexander and Pyrrhus. By this point, Scipio may have expected his own name to appear next. After all, he had defeated Hannibal himself at Zama and brought the Second Punic War to a victorious conclusion for Rome. He therefore asked Hannibal whom he would rank third. Hannibal answered that the third position belonged to himself. He justified the choice by recalling the scale of what he had achieved while still a relatively young commander. He had established Carthaginian dominance across much of Spain, led an army through hostile territory, crossed the Alps in an undertaking that seemed almost impossible, and descended into Italy before Rome could stop him. For years he had operated inside Roman territory, defeating army after army and creating a crisis that threatened the survival of the Republic. Hannibal also emphasized how little direct support he had received from Carthage during those campaigns. Despite fighting far from his principal base, he had devastated Roman territory, defeated major Roman forces, destroyed or captured numerous communities, and repeatedly brought fear close to Rome itself. His argument was essentially that the magnitude of these achievements justified placing him among history's greatest commanders, even though he had ultimately lost the war. Scipio listened as Hannibal continued describing his accomplishments. Amused by the direction of the conversation, he finally interrupted with an obvious question. If Hannibal considered himself the third greatest commander, despite having been defeated by Scipio, where would he have placed himself if he had actually won? Hannibal immediately recognized the opportunity hidden inside the question. Had he defeated Scipio, he replied, he would have ranked himself above Alexander. The answer was clever on several levels. Hannibal continued to praise his own abilities, but at the same time he paid Scipio an extraordinary compliment. If victory over Scipio would have elevated Hannibal above Alexander, then the man who had actually defeated Hannibal must himself have possessed exceptional military ability. Instead of directly praising his former enemy, Hannibal transformed his own boast into a subtle acknowledgement of Scipio's greatness. Their exchange did not end bitterly. Hannibal invited Scipio to dine with him, suggesting that whatever hostility had once existed between them had become something closer to mutual respect. Scipio answered that he would gladly have accepted under different circumstances. The problem was not Hannibal personally, but the fact that he was now living at the court of Antiochus, a king whose intentions Rome deeply distrusted. The story presents the two former enemies in a striking way. Hannibal had spent years destroying Roman armies and threatening the Republic, while Scipio had ultimately defeated him and forced Carthage to accept peace. Yet when they encountered one another years later, they were capable of speaking almost as professional equals. Their old struggle remained part of their identities, but personal hatred no longer dominated the relationship. The later fate of Hannibal provides a darker contrast. After Antiochus was eventually defeated by Rome, Hannibal was forced to continue his life as a fugitive. He moved from one court to another until he found protection with Prusias, king of Bithynia. By then, Hannibal no longer commanded the enormous armies of his youth, and Carthage itself had lost the ability to challenge Roman supremacy. According to the tradition preserved in this account, Flamininus later arrived at the court of Prusias on diplomatic business. Unlike Scipio, he showed little generosity toward the aging Hannibal. He had no major personal grievance against him, and there was no immediate military threat comparable to the days when Hannibal had marched through Italy. Nevertheless, pressure was placed upon Prusias, leaving Hannibal with little hope of escape. Rather than allow himself to be captured by his enemies, Hannibal took poison and ended his own life. His death brought an extraordinary career to a lonely conclusion, far from Carthage and far from the Italian battlefields where his name had once terrified Rome. Ancient tradition connected his death with a curious prophecy. Hannibal had supposedly been told that Libysan earth would eventually cover his remains. He interpreted this as a prediction that he would die in Libya, the land associated with Carthage and North Africa. Instead, the prophecy was said to have been fulfilled in an unexpected way. In Bithynia there was a place associated with the name Libyssa, connected with the river Libyssus. Hannibal therefore died in a land whose name seemed to satisfy the words of the prophecy, even though it was far from the Libya he had imagined. For ancient writers, such coincidences carried a powerful sense of fate. The prediction had supposedly been correct, but Hannibal had misunderstood its meaning. The episode ultimately became more than a story about military rivalry. Scipio and Hannibal, two men who had once fought for the survival of their respective states, were remembered as capable of recognizing greatness in one another after the war was over. Their famous conversation at Ephesus captured that mutual respect, while Hannibal's later death offered a far less dignified conclusion to the life of one of antiquity's greatest commanders.